Hey guys, what is up? Super K Man Rocks here, and we're here for my LPL Week 2 overview and analysis video. Very excited to get into it. Of course, the LPL is jam-packed in terms of games and in terms of action over the course of the week with 7 full days, a lot of those being super days now, so I don't want to waste too much time on this intro. Very quickly, if you want to see my analysis on Week 1 and my primer video going over all of these teams and what I expect from them in depth, you can check out the LPL playlist up in the iCard. And outside of that, I want to hear what you guys thought of the LPL in week number 2 down in the comments section below. Did things go as you expected, or were there surprises? Are you kind of shocked about the teams that are doing well / not doing well at the current moment? Would just love to hear you guys' thoughts and feedback on whatever you want to talk about when it comes to the LPL down in the comments section below. But without further ado, let's jump right into the content. If you are new here, what we're going to do in this video is go series by series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the series and a dud of the series for each individual series that we cover here. At the end of the week, I'll be giving a player of the week and a dud of the week to kind of tie everything into a nice, neat little bow here in week number 2. And of course, I will also be updating my power rankings for all 17 teams in the LPL after week number 2. So we've got a lot to cover. Let's jump right into day number 1. We kicked off day number 1 with a battle of red teams, FunPlus Phoenix taking on Team WE. And WE is going to pick up the 2-1 series win in this one. This is a nice win, a very important one for a team that I think has generally looked pretty good to start the year. This is kind of a collection of good players, and you're kind of hoping that that can become a great team. And I think generally that's a pretty good strategy, so long as you bring in the right players who might want to play together. But FPX, I think, generally has also looked a lot better than maybe people would have anticipated to start the year. I'm really excited to see Milky Way actually get some full time here in the jungle. And honestly, FPX looked really good in this series. WE was just cleaner in terms of their execution down the stretch. Player of the series for me is going to go to Wayward in the top lane. A lot of people wrote him off. I've always been a Wayward defender. In fact, I've gotten pushback in previous years on this channel for being a Wayward defender. He has always had more good games than bad games. I think the bad games just stood out a lot more because he was on a good team. I've always compared him to a player like Morgan over in the LCK, where Morgan got a really bad rap when he was on a team like Hanwha Life, having to play with Chovy and Deft and really filling this big role, trying to be on one of the best teams in the world. That was just too much for him, and he really struggled in that role. But as soon as he went over to Bro and really kind of got a better circumstance in terms of expectation around him and didn't have the responsibility that maybe he would have had on Hanwha Life, he actually turned into a really good top laner. I think the same exact thing is happening to Wayward. He is very quickly going to turn into one of the best top laners in the league. He has dominated this series so far. He has easily been WE's best player over the course of this season, I should say. And he plays aggressive picks. I mean, the Rumble was miserable in game number 2. Shout out that Rumble game. But both of the Darius games were super good, and he really is the reason they were able to win game number 3. Without the Darius being able to take over, they don't win this series. I don't think it's a lock that he ends up as player of the series because, again, that Rumble game in game 2 was awful, but he was probably the best player in their 2 wins in games 1 and 3. And so I really wanted to give him player of the series as kind of a nod to that. I think Fofo obviously deserves a lot of a shout out here. Also been high on Fofo. I thought he got a lot of hate on EDG last year for what was essentially no reason. Like, I understand that people don't like him because of off-the-Rift stuff. I'm right there with you, but I try to judge these players based on what they show on the Rift, and Fofo has just been a very good mid laner for a little while now. Is he top 4, top 5? Probably not, but is he, like, top 6, top 7? Probably. Like, he's somewhere in that vein. You can definitely win with Fofo in the mid lane, and he, again, showed that, especially on the Corki in game number 1. If he had a better Azir game in game 3, I think I would have given him player of the series, but the Jace game, the Azir game, they just weren't stand out enough for me to give him that. Corki, I thought, was a really good pick for him in game number 1, and generally we're seeing Corki rise back up in terms of success level over in the eastern regions because it's just been given more time. In the west, it's kind of struggled, but you can definitely see the strength of it here. So the soul laner is definitely stepping up, but I will say the rest of WE, certainly some question marks. I think Awandi has certainly not started off this year super hot. I thought the Ashe game in game 2 was really bad. Some of the Nautilus engages haven't exactly been great. Prince hasn't exactly been this takeover threat in the bot lane. I think he's been good. His positioning has been fine, but he doesn't have that killer instinct that he had in the LCK and in the LCS. I think that's just going to come with time. He's never been a player that I've been worried about playing too passively. That's kind of what the problem is at the current moment for him, so I would expect that to change. And the one player that you can look at and say, yeah, maybe he didn't have a great series here for WE was Hang in the jungle, Milky Way was significantly better than Hang here. The problem was that Milky Way ended up playing Diana in game 3, and there's just not a lot of usefulness if you're not able to get the Diana combo off, and so even though he was fed, didn't really matter. Hang does need to be a bit better. He was somebody who we wanted to see some growth out of after a pretty good rookie year from him last year. Hasn't exactly shown that at the beginning of the split. It's mostly been the solo laners that have been able to push WE across the finish line, but at least they're getting pushed across the finish line. If they would have lost this series, I would have been a bit concerned, but they were able to take it even if it wasn't the cleanest games of all time. And then for FPX, this team's actually pretty good. Like, they're not a bad team by any stretch. Again, I really like that they fully committed to Milky Way in the jungle. I think that this is definitely the right move. As much as I thought Moyam was interesting and, you know, one of those players that if he joined an LPL bottom tier team, I would have been intrigued to see what he was able to do. Milky Way was a player in the LDL I was really, really high on. And, you know, I talked about the 6-man rotation and just kind of playing whichever jungler you felt was better for FPX. And I think that is very clearly Milky Way. He was amazing in this series. The Lee Sin game in game 2, the Diana game in game 3, even in the loss, both of them were very good. Diana Yone can be a very scary duo, and honestly, it did feel like that jungle mid was doing really well for most of that third game. The problem was that top lane just fell apart super fast, and you had no way to deal with the Darius, with Diana, and with Yone, and with Ezreal. You just don't have a way to break through that bruiser in the top side. Once he starts generating damage, you have so much CC on the side of WE, so much lockdown that it makes it so much easier to deal with, you know, these fed, squishier members of FPX, and they just weren't able to get the job done. And a lot of that is my dud of the series, Zhao Lao, who, you know, it's going to be put on him on the Cassante. You know, he's kind of an interesting player. I think he's gotten better over the past year. I've talked about that on the channel. Certainly, I think has shown his best stuff in the LPL. This is a player who has been given chance after chance after chance and has never really been one to capitalize on it, but you know, he's finally starting to figure things out, but Wayward was just straight up better than him in the back half of the series. Game 2 was definitely favored to Zhao Laohu, but Game 1, Game 3, not very good, and he was a big reason why they lost Game 3 in the first place, giving Darius so much gold in the mid game, which was definitely a bit of a problem. But outside of that, I honestly think that FPX is a pretty interesting team to watch. Can this team be a playoff team? I certainly think it's within the realm of possibilities. I don't think I'm necessarily going to put them there yet. They were 13 after last week, but they continue to show that they're at least going to fight in some of these games against better teams, and I think that that's something that maybe last year's FPX team just wouldn't do. But for WE, nice win here. This does feel like a pretty good team. How good can they be? I guess we'll have to see. Like, this is a team that I think theoretically has like top 4, top 5 upside. Hasn't necessarily come to fruition yet. I think they need more consistency out of players like Hang and Awandi, the secondary players, but the solo laners I think are playing really well right now, specifically Wayward, who I think has had a great start to the season. If he can keep that up, you know, have a solid lane to be able to play through, have carries in the back half of the game that you can rely on, that's a pretty good recipe for at least being a competent team here in spring. Then moving on to our second series of day 1 here, and not really a huge upset as we saw Bilibili Gaming taking on Anyone's Legend. Bilibili being able to pick up the 2-0 series win here. Not, again, an upset or anything like that, but still nice to see BLG continue their hot streak at the start of the season. We were wondering whether or not these players were going to mesh well. Obviously, 4 members returning from last year, but a big change in the mid lane. You just never really know how that's going to affect a lot of the dynamics when it comes to this team. There was a world in which Yagao leaving and Knight coming in and being a bit more resource heavy could actually cause this team to struggle a bit more, but it's basically been the opposite. The Knight Revenge Tour is continuing here. He has made it a mission for him to come out and dominate basically every single game that he has played so far in the spring split, and honestly, he has succeeded at that goal. He's going to get player of the series once again here for Bilibili. That's 3 series for BLG, 3 player of the series in my opinion for Knight. He really has been that dude so far for BLG. They are playing through him. He is dealing a ridiculous amount of damage. That Syndra game in game number 1 was amazing. The Nico ultimates were still really good, comboed him very well with the Jarvan ultimates that I think kind of made it very difficult for AL to actually play the game with a comp that is, you know, kind of difficult to execute on outside of the Rumble. It just opens up a lot of options and situations for Knight and June to be able to play super aggro into a comp like that, and I think they executed on that well. But again, that Syndra game in game 1 was nearly perfect. Playing Syndra into Tristana isn't always the easiest matchup in the world. I'm a pretty big fan of Syndra as a pick, not only right now in the meta, but just generally. I think she offers so much as a mid laner, and I think Knight plays her just about as well as anybody in the world. Pairing that up with something like a Lee Sin that can play super fast, super early, it's very good. There was a big jungle gap in this series as well. June continues to look amazing. I would argue that June Jun and Knight are actually looking better at the current moment than Jun and Yagao did as a duo. Obviously, Yagao fixed a lot of that team's problems last year with Elkanon overextending and Bin wanting to play super aggro on the top side. They've had to make some more concessions, Bin being a lot more of a tank player, Elkanon not getting nearly as many early game resources, being isolated a bit more in the 2v2, but honestly, it has kind of helped this team out a bit. Jun has looked better, and Elkanon are really good in the 2v2. Just because they're not having to 3v3 all game doesn't mean that they're not getting resources and not being put in a position to actively help the team. Elk was awesome, On was awesome, and On in particular has been amazing to start this split. BLG just feels like they are the best team in the LPL at the current moment, and I think this series was just another example of that. And then for AL on the other side, I mean, they're okay. Like, they tried some things, especially in game one, to make things interesting. There were some engages that I thought were relatively fine. The problem was they just didn't have the skill to be able to keep up with the best players on BLG. Dud of the series is going to go to Krako. Krako was really good last week for AL, so I'm not going to freak out too much. His inconsistencies have been pretty well documented, but I think as long as he's only losing to Shun and Knight and, players like that, I'm not going to freak out. The Xin Zhao game was pretty bad in game two. The gap that we saw between Shun and Krako once that Jarvan was able to get an early lead was pretty massive. The Xin Zhao became essentially irrelevant over the back half of that game, but it wasn't just him that was bad. Shanks definitely got outplayed in the series, specifically on the Tristana in game number one, where he just really didn't have any prio. Hope and Kale were fine. Hope could have been a little bit more active, I think, across the map, but as a Zeri, there's really just not a lot you can do. Maybe that's why you don't pick Zeri, because you're kind of reliant on the rest of your team setting you up in a way that maybe that champion wasn't a couple of years ago, last year, but, it's fine. Hope wasn't absolutely a disaster. Kale wasn't a disaster. Harry was whatever on the top side. 2 games of Rumble, and both had very negligible team fight impacts. We're kind of seeing that in the Eastern regions, which is very weird to say. Rumble seems like a pick that is much stronger right now in the LCS and in the LEC than it has been in the LCK and the LPL. Don't really know why that is, but teams just don't necessarily allow him to get off these massive ultimates and team fights the same way that it feels so inevitable in some of the Western regions, but, it's just something I've noticed. Krako, I think, was the one who needed to be better. Shanks probably needed to be better, but again, you're playing against Bilibili. You're not freaking out too much because you weren't able to win this series. You were able to keep game one relatively close, and I think there are some good takeaways from this. You just need to be a bit more clinical. This team is still 1-2, not an awful situation, very similar to what we talked about with FPX. There is a very high probability that, the last couple of playoff spots in the LPL are going to be pretty wide open. 9 and 10 don't really feel all that, locked in, and even number 8 for like WE in my power rankings right now doesn't feel like a dominant team. There are going to be opportunities, and AL is one of the teams that is going to be competing for those opportunities. Just because you weren't able to get the win here doesn't mean that this team can't continue to look interesting as the split goes on. But for Bilibili, like I said, this is probably the best team in the LPL right now. Really strong argument so far that this is the best team in the world. Knight, like I said, looks like he's on a revenge tour, a revenge mission right now. He feels, I think, pretty vindicated for leaving or getting kicked off of JD Gaming, going to a team in Bilibili, and just dominating the beginning part of this split. I want to see what he does against the best teams in the league. We saw that a bit last week, but I really want to see what happens when he starts playing teams like JD Gaming, starts playing teams like Ninjas in Pyjamas, starts playing teams like even LNG Esports. I think there are obviously some things that you would want to see out of this team before you just anoint them as the best team in the world, but they're certainly on pace for that right now. Basically, every positive thing I said about them in the preseason has so far looked pretty good. And then moving on to day number 2 here in week number 2 of the LPL, we kicked it off with the matchup between Royal Never Give Up and Ultra Prime, and this is the free space on the LPL bingo board over the course of the entire split. It's RNG picking up a 2-0 win against Ultra Prime. Ultra Prime does not feel particularly competitive in their current state. It doesn't feel like they are actually going to be able to even really keep up with anybody else, and I think there is no better example of that than game number 1. What the hell's going on, man? I mean, is Doggo protesting? Like, I genuinely don't know what's happening. If somebody has an idea, maybe there was a rumor or anything, let me know down in the comment section below, but Rammus Yumi, like, what are we doing? Why are we doing this? What do you even want me to say about Rammus Yumi? Of course this thing didn't work. Of course they lost to Varus Ashe. I get it, it's triple marksman on the side of RNG, and Rammus theoretically is very good into triple marksman, but you know what happened? Poppy just won the game. Like, Poppy Vi just insta-won the game, and I don't really know what you thought was gonna happen outside of that. It's crazy to me that Doggo's not even my dud of the series. We'll get into that as we go further along, but player of the series, in a good way, is going to go to Breathe in the top lane. He continues to look amazing for RNG. There were people that told me I was underrating Breathe in my preseason, power rankings and predictions, my primer video when I ranked all the players in the top lane. I think I had him around 5 in terms of my top lane rankings, maybe number 4, maybe number 6, like somewhere in that range. And honestly, like maybe I was underrating him. Maybe this guy's like clear top 2, top 3, because he has been amazing to start this split, even when some of the rest of these players aren't exactly the most consistent. Basically, everybody else on this team has taken turns being really bad throughout their first 3 series, but Breathe has been pretty fantastic. He dominated game number 1. That Poppy really shut down whatever Ultra Prime was trying to accomplish with this draft, and then the Jackson game 2 was even better in terms of being able to jump in and deal a ridiculous amount of damage. Look how squishy Ultra Prime is. If the Jax is able to get in, it's an insta-win. Even with Decade playing better in game number 2 on the Aatrox, there just really was no way to be able to deal with that Jax as we went further along. So, good for RNG fans. At least you still have Breathe in the top lane. There are a lot of RNG fans that I think were frustrated by the trade that brought Breathe here in the first place because they got rid of Bin, and obviously that's turned out to maybe not be a great trade, but Breathe is still a phenomenal top laner, one of the best in the entire world, and he continues to be this team's best player. I thought Wei also had a pretty good series here. You're allowed to do that when you play Hacker, just kind of is the way that it is, but the Vi in particular in game 1 I thought was really solid. The Sedge could have been more active in game 2, but generally I don't think Wei made any major mistakes. I think everybody on this team was fine. For RNG, Tongyuan, LWX, Ming all probably had their best series of the year up until this point, but again, it's against Ultra Prime, so how much can you really put stock into it? It is nice to see that LWX and Ming can have a good series as a duo. That was starting to get a bit concerning after the first couple of times we'd seen them together. Obviously, I'm a bit lower on LWX, but Ming had been pretty bad to start this year. Obviously, how much can you expect that to continue? I don't know, but they certainly looked a lot more competent in game number 2 here when they were able to play something like the Senatom Kenshin just be weak side. Tong Yuan definitely showing some development. Yuik has at least a decent laner, and so, being able to outlane him on an assassin versus assassin matchup, which is kind of Yuikai's specialty, it's something that is at least a positive sign here generally for RNG, but it's really hard to take anything away from beating Ultra Prime. Like, that's really the takeaway for me, is that how much can you really glean from beating the worst team in the league? Just not a ton for me. And so for Ultra Prime, you're the worst team in the league. 0-3, one of those losses being to LGD. You drafted Rammus Yumi in the bot lane with a Graves in the jungle. Obviously, you lost. Like, there's really not a lot I can say outside of that. Hacker is going to get done of the series here. Miserable stuff from Hacker. The Graves was awful. The Brand was worse. He sometimes has these series. He's one of the players that, I don't want to say I'm defending on this channel. I just don't think he's as bad as people say he is. I don't think he's, like, guaranteed, top 20 jungle, like, not even an LPL caliber jungler. There are going to be games where he's mostly fine, but there are also going to be games where he is completely miserable, and he was really bad in this series. That's definitely something to keep in mind. Decade was awful in game 1, got a little bit more, I guess, stable on the Aatrox in game number 2, but that Jax game was awful. Doggo Jwai picked Rammus Yumi. Like, what do you want me to say? I don't know what to tell you. Like, poor Jwai here, because he's a very interesting support player. I think he's somebody who on a different roster in a different organization could potentially be an interesting prospect, but having to play with Doggo, who's clearly just out of his mind at the current moment, is not ideal. Yuikai tried his best to do anything, but ended up losing the isolated 1v1 even on a signature Akali. In game number 2, just not a lot of good stuff coming in from Ultra Prime. This is the worst team in the LPL. They are one of the worst teams in the top 4 major regions. I don't really see them being favorites. Like I said, they're kind of the free space on the bingo board right now for the LPL. Basically, anybody who goes up against them is going to feel pretty good about generating some confidence after beating them. And so, tough stuff for Ultra Prime, but that's kind of the circumstance and the predicament they put themselves in. But nice win for RNG anyways. You put yourself back above 500 here, going 4-3 after your first 3 series. Nice to see that. It's great to get the confidence, like I said, beating Ultra Prime, but I'm going to have to see you do it against better teams. And, after not really looking all that great in week 1, I want to see a more convincing win against a more convincing team. For now, you take what you can get. It would have been worse if they would have lost, but this isn't exactly a big game changer for me in terms of perception. And then moving on to our second series of day 2, and man, am I excited to talk about this? I don't know. It's just kind of depressing. It's LGD Gaming taking on Edward Gaming, and LGD is going to pick up the 2-0 series win. EDG falling to 0-3, 1-6. To start the season. EDG is just not good. I think at this point we can say it. This is not a very good League of Legends team. So much is going wrong for an organization that is so prestigious here in the LPL. This is one of the worst teams in the LPL, full stop. LGD is a team that a lot of people predicted to be pretty clearly in the bottom 2. They were able to beat Ultra Prime last week, and some people thought that might have been their only win all split long. Well, here they are, above 500 with a 2-1 record, but at the cost of EDG, who genuinely looks like they are a part of this bottom tier of teams at the current moment. We can go ahead and talk about it, but it's just kind of a negative vibe around EDG, which is not really what I like to, talk about here on the channel. But let's talk about the positives for LGD, at least for now. Player of the series is going to go to Jinzhao in the support position. He has a series like this basically every split where he comes out and looks really good on enchanters against a team that just doesn't have any way of dealing with them. And you kind of trick yourself into being like, oh, okay, maybe this experiment's actually working out. He's done it basically every year the last 2 years. You've sat there and been like, I can see where they're going, with Jinzhao here. Kepler continues to be really bad for this team, which we will talk about, but Jinzhao actually was really good in this series. The Renata in game number 1 was fantastic, and he was just as good in game number 2 to set up a lot of the stuff that players like Bertel and Haichao were able to capitalize on to create advantages in the mid to late game. He's not a bad player. He's not a good player. Like, I don't want this to change my perception of him too much, because again, we basically see this once a split from a player like Jinzhao, or at least once a year from a player like Jinzhao, and, from him in particular, but at least he does it once a year. At least he has these series where he comes out and looks pretty good for short periods of time. So, credit to Jinzhao. I thought he was good here. Meteor's going to get a lot of the credit for this series, especially on the Rel in game number 2. And while those engages were really good, I don't think the Maokai in game number 1 was particularly ecstatic from me. It didn't really excite me a whole ton. That's why Jinzhao gets player of the series over Meteor. But again, I understand that, he's not necessarily a tank player. And for him to come out on these engagers, these more tanky engage style junglers that I always talk about and look really good into a player like Jeje, who should be one of the best junglers in the world, it's a very good sign. Meteor is a pretty solid player, one that is definitely better than the org that he has been stuck on. Bertel and Haichao did a very good job of capitalizing in the back half of this series. Haichao, in particular, has actually started out 2024 incredibly hot. If he's going to be able to keep that up, LGD is absolutely going to be able to outperform what my expectations for this team were going into the year. I mean, he was just really, really solid in the back half of this series, and Bertel, I thought, did a really good job of dealing damage. Sometimes was a little bit too far forward, but for the most part was a positive. Kepler continues to look really bad, like genuinely like one of the worst players in the LPL, even when the rest of the team is going, in a good direction. I think that is something that is certainly worth monitoring. He has been really, really bad, and he was really bad last year for JDG's LDL team, and so I don't really expect him to turn this around, but, it was good enough to be able to win this series, and they're above 500. This is a 2-1 team going into the second half of week number 2. A lot of people are really surprised by that, me included, and this was certainly not a win I expected for them to get on their resume, but for EDG, it's just full panic mode, full disaster at this point. Losing to LGD is just about as low as you can get here. Dead of the series is going to go to Leave in the bot lane. He's been really bad to start this split. Him and Vampire have negative chemistry in terms of what they're able to do isolated in the 2v2, and both of them look like very bad players right now. Vampire is not an LPL caliber support. That has become abundantly clear the more he has played in the LPL, as he just looks outclassed by everybody that he's going up against. I mean, Jinzhao in this series outclassed him, and that's just really a bad sign. But Leave, I mean, talk about a player that really broke out at the beginning of 2023 in Spring Split, looked like the next big AD carry for this team. Then the controversy happens. He gets taken off of the roster. He doesn't get to play with these players anymore. Is given that spot again here at the start of 2024, but it's not looking good. Like, the mechanics are not looking good. It's not just the mentality. It's not just the way that they're playing around him. It's the individual performances from Leave that give me a bunch of concern. And again, maybe it's because he has the worst support in the LPL right now, but he individually is not playing well, and he's going to have to step it up and be better. Some of this team was actually good in this series. I think Fisher easily had his best games of the series. The Azir, the Akali looked really good. They just didn't really matter in the late game team fights. He really wasn't able to actually get any damage in when the game mattered the most. Same thing for Jeje, who was able to generate pressure in the early game and didn't necessarily give over a lot of attention, but was the Trundle nearly as viable as the Rel in the back half of game number 2? No, it wasn't. Also worth noting, Ale didn't play this series. They put in solo kill. They really want to go for this youth movement. He was fine in the top lane. I really don't think he was actually all that bad. He played a couple of these fights pretty well. And like I said, Jeje and Fisher had good moments. Bot lane was just such an albatross in this series. They were an anchor towards what EDG is doing, and they kind of have been. And Fisher generally has been awful throughout this split, so when you finally get 2 good games out of him, for you to still not be able to beat one of the worst teams in the league, that's not a good sign, man. That is really, really terrifying. It doesn't really seem like anything is going EDG's way, and I kept them in my top 10 after week number 1 because I wanted to see them lose to teams that were definitively worse than them in terms of the talent level. Well, we've seen that now. This is a team that I am in full panic mode for because they look like one of the worst teams in the LPL at the current moment. And for LGD, I mean, this team's above 500. That's amazing. They're 4-3 in game score. Nobody would have seen that coming. Still don't think they're a very good team because Kepler is going to continue to be a problem. And as much as I think Bertle and Meteor and Haichao have been very interesting to start this split, I just don't know how sustainable it is to have a bot lane like this and actually be able to win. Bertle and Haichao are not exactly the most consistent players in the entire world, and so I would expect this team to eventually come back down to earth. But at least for now, picking up wins over teams that are struggling like Ultra Prime and EDG, that's what you need to do if you want to be a team that is at the very least competitive. This could be a year where LGD maybe doesn't make playoffs, but at the very least makes it interesting, or more interesting than maybe we anticipated. Then moving on to day number 3 here, and we kicked off day 3 with a battle between two teams that have a bit to prove. It's Rare Atom taking on Invictus Gaming, and IG with a strong 2-0 series win here. Rare Atom's descent down the standings has been noticeable. This is an 0-6 start. That is the worst record in the LPL, period. But nobody else is 0-6 to start the LPL year, and Rare Atom owns that by themselves at 0-3 in terms of series score. This was a team that looked so good in Demacia Cup, that felt like it had a lot of pieces that were very interesting, but man, things have just not worked out for this roster. Basically, everybody has taken a major step back from what they were in recent memory, and it doesn't look good for the outlook of this team going forward. But for Invictus, I was really curious about how they were going to look against a team that was maybe around their skill level. They got to destroy Ultra Prime in their first series, and they got destroyed by a team that was significantly better than them. What were they going to look like when they got to play teams that are relatively in their same sphere, in their same zone? Well, they looked pretty good in this series, and it continues to go back to one player in particular, and that is Cryan in the mid lane. We might be looking at a re-breakout for Cryan. I mean, they've played 3 series, and he's been player of the series in both of their wins and dud of the series in their only loss. He is definitely the focal point of what Invictus Gaming wants to do here. His Azir ultimates down the stretch in some of these games were incredibly valuable, and I don't think they win these games without those plays coming in from him, but he can be a bit inconsistent. It's really, really interesting to watch him become this priority player for Invictus when he's really never been that over the course of his career. For RNG, for Ultra Prime, for every other roster that he has played for, he's kind of been a secondary carry, a more facilitative piece. He is the guy here on Invictus Gaming, and that definitely makes things more interesting. His mechanics are very good at the current moment. He has a very good idea of where he needs to be, specifically in late game team fights. I do struggle sometimes to praise him in terms of his active laning phases, because there are times where he's just not aggressive enough in order to generate these big leads. Reminds me of players like Jensen, like Niski, over in the western regions where, sometimes they fail to generate these massive leads on their own and more so rely on their ability to outplay their opponents both macro and teamfight-wise towards the back half of the game. Cryan does have a bit of that in him, but he is so good in the teamfight stage that honestly, sometimes it doesn't matter. Those mistakes that he makes earlier in games don't end up costing him too much. So generally, pretty in on Cryan at the current moment, and he's definitely the focal point for Invictus. I thought On and Wink definitely had a better series here. Nice to see On back in. I didn't really know what they were doing with Xiao Yueji. Like, I like Xiao Yueji as a prospect, but he has not been good basically at any time he's been given LPL, time and opportunity. He has not been strong at that level, and so for On to come back in for a team that I think is trying to win, at least a little bit right now, with some playoff spots potentially opening up down the stretch here, it was nice to see these two actually play a series together and actually look good. I thought Tianjin had one of his best series in a while. He looks a lot more stable this year. I don't know what's happened in the offseason, but one of his big problems last year was that he would actively flip games at around 10-ish minutes. He would make a play that is 50-50. If it goes right, IG easily wins, and if it goes wrong, they insta lose the game at that moment. He seems to have cut off a lot of those plays and is a lot better at playing within structure, a lot better at getting his laners, specifically mid lane, more resources to allow them to be able to do a lot. That's all he needed to do. That was what he did really well in the LDL. That was the reason this team called him up in the first place, was he was really good at playing within structure and allowing his laners to win him games at the LDL level. Obviously, if he can just be a really good facilitative, tanky engage style jungler that isn't flipping games, that's huge for this team because you have enough talent to be able to win, and I was critical of him, for his aggressive tendencies, but it's going to be interesting to see if he can maintain this as we continue to go throughout the season. He's been pretty good, I would say, to start the year, and you should know me, not the star breakout that I think people were expecting. I really think that he's kind of just become just a guy in the top lane. I think a lot of the aggressive things that made him a star at the beginning of last year are just things that teams are prepared for and ready to stop at this point, which is definitely a little bit sad, but Cryan is certainly making up for that by being as good as he is in the mid lane right now. And like I said, On and Wink, specifically Wink on the Rakan, looked really good in this series. But for Rare Atom on the other side here, This is not a good team right now. And I don't really know what's going wrong because this team looked so good in, just like a month ago in Demacia Cup. I really can't imagine what has changed so much. Jungle mid I thought was going to be a strength. Top lane I thought was going to continue to develop. And even if I'm not a fan of this bot lane, I thought top side was going to be good enough to at least make them interesting. But so far, it's been the opposite of that. Vikla was miserable in week number 1. He was dud of the week entirely for week 1. Significantly better in this series on the Corki. Didn't really make any mistakes and was actually trying to keep this team in game number 2. He was the reason they were almost able to win it, but it's everybody else that has been a disaster. Assume is going to get my dud of the series. He was better on the Kalista, but that Senna game in game 1 was horrible. I mean, truly horrible. I can't imagine playing a champion like Senna, who is so broken on the patch that they are playing on, so poorly in a series like this, and Assume definitely deserves some criticism for that. I am notoriously lower on him as a player. I've certainly not seen this breakout AD carry, trajectory that I think other analysts have necessarily seen, but, him and Zora have no chemistry in the bot lane. I still think it's a mistake to be playing Zora over Xiaoxi, who you have on this team, who went to Worlds last year, who looked particularly good on that Flying Oysters team. I don't really know what Zora is doing. He's just kind of a guy down in the bot lane, and they're not winning. It's taking pressure away from Neyu in the jungle, who, quite frankly, has not been the player that I thought he would be. He was my pick for Rookie of the Year going into this season. Obviously, there are some big rookies, on better teams that I think are going to be given more opportunities, but Neyu was the player that I thought was the most interesting player coming up from the LDL this offseason, and he has not necessarily shown that at the start of this year. Xiaoshu has just kind of been a guy. He was actually okay in this series, but Vikla was the only player to play well on Rare Adam, and he was easily their worst player in week number 1. So I don't really have a lot of positives to say about this RA team. They've yet to win a game, let alone a series, and I don't really know where that's going to come in. Right now, whatever momentum they were able to generate at the beginning of the year in Demacia Cup is gone. They are in the bottom tier of teams right now in the LPL, and maybe they figure it out. Maybe, things start to get back on track if Neyu and Vikla in particular can form a nice duo, but if that doesn't happen, I really don't see this team even remotely being competitive in the way that they're currently playing. They are passive, they want to scale, and they're not good at team fights, and so I don't really know what the idea is for them, but it's not working at the current moment. Hopefully Rare Adam can figure something out, but for Invictus on the other side, they're an interesting team. They're in that same cluster with FPX and Anyone's Legend that we've already talked about this week, where these are interesting teams that potentially could make a case to be playoff teams if they continue to look good more consistently, but there's just a lot of hurdles that all these teams have to jump over because they are a bit of a talent gap from the good teams in the league. It'll be interesting to see what happens, but this is at the very least a nice win for Invictus to get above 500. Then moving on to our second series of day 3 here, and it's a battle between top teams, kind of the opposite of the first series. It was Ninjas in Pyjamas taking on JD Gaming, and JDG is going to pick up the nice 2-0 win, continuing to cement themselves amongst that top 2 alongside Bilibili, and I think that's just where we sit. As much as I really like Ninjas in Pyjamas, and as much as I thought they looked amazing in week number 1, so much so that I moved them into my top 4 in my power rankings, JDG is just on a different level. This is a team that you would expect to be able to walk out of this series with a 2-0 win, and that's exactly what they did. Now, the way that they went about it was honestly even more impressive than maybe you would even think it would be at the beginning of the week, or even just looking at this win, because it wasn't the players that you would expect to dominate that came out and dominated. When you see JDG versus Ninjas in Pyjamas, this looks like a field day for Ruler. This looks like the perfect setup for Ruler to kind of destroy Photic and Juo, one of the weaker bot lanes amongst the top teams, and really carry this team to a victory, but that wasn't what happened in this. You had an amazing top lane performance, you had an amazing mid lane performance, and I think that's honestly even more encouraging for me when it comes to JDG. There were questions about who was going to be the top laner for them going into the season just because of so many of the rumors that were floating around. Clearly, they made the right choice by going with the player with the high proven standard here. Player of the series, if it's not clear enough, is going to go to Flandre in the top lane. It didn't even look like Flandre was going to be starting this year for JDG. I know I had some people in my comment section that were like, obviously Flandre is starting for JDG. Why would they bring him in to not start? But that was the report, based on what everybody was saying. Anybody who had sources and information surrounding the LPL, they were saying that Sheer was gonna be the starting top laner this year, that Flandre was essentially brought in to be a safety blanket. Now, there are also rumors that the only reason Sheer isn't in the lineup right now is because of service time, essentially rules that the LPL has, where Sheer needs to play a certain amount of games at the LDL level in order to qualify to play in the LPL, but I can't imagine that they would want to take Flandre out with how he has played in these first couple series. That K'Sante game in Game 2 was magnificent, and it's not like he was playing some guy in the top lane. He was playing Shanji, one of the best top laners in the world at this point in time, and so you just gotta respect Flandre. This has absolutely been the right decision, and he has looked amazing since coming back here to the LPL. Yagao looked great in this series. Both the Taliyah and the Akali looked great, but especially the Taliyah, moving around the map, creating chaos and havoc. That's what Yagao does. He really pushes this team forward macro-wise, and this was a big reason why people were excited about JD Gaming no matter what the top lane situation was going to look like, because yes, you're losing maybe the most mechanically talented player in the world in Knight, but you're gaining maybe the most high-impact macro player in the world in Yagao. It's hardly a fair trade-off for either team. I mean, both are gaining in this situation, and Yagao continued to look good. Rookie had a great week 1, and I think Yagao made him look pretty useless, I would say, in this series in terms of being in the right spot in the right, part of the map. Rookie was still fine. We'll get into that. He was probably the best player on NIP this series, but Yagao was better. Kanavi looked good. Ruler and Missing took a back seat. Specifically, Ruler, not what I would have anticipated. He was still doing a ridiculous amount of damage, and his positioning in these fights is just perfect. He, again, made Foduk look pretty bad in this series because he was just out trading him on a Lucian into Caitlyn. You should never be able to do that in the early game if you were the Lucian player, but he made that champion look busted. Generally, JDG just looks like the untouchable form that they showed last year as well. It very much feels like a big 2 in the LPL right now, and JDG is very much a part of that. But for NIP on the other side, I'm not going to freak out too much. Rookie still looked pretty okay in this series, and Foduk and Zhuo could have looked worse. There were definitely expectations for them to potentially get run over by this 2v2 in the bot lane. Didn't quite happen, even if they weren't particularly good. The concern is the OMG players on the top side of the map. Shanji and Aki, who I think neither had a particularly good series. Shanji's going to get my dud of the series, because Flandre really did get super far ahead on the K'Sante in Game 2. Both the Lilia and the Aatrox looked really bad. You could give this to Aki in the jungle, who I think also looked bad, especially on the Poppy in Game number 2, where they just lost pressure so early on into the series, but I'm not freaking out. Like, these are two good players that have been good over the course of an entire season for not only this organization, but, for other organizations as a duo in the past. I'm not going to sit here and say that I'm all of a sudden knocking them down a ton of rankings. Now, there is one bit of thing to potentially be concerned about, which is the idea that maybe they are good, not great players, or I should say maybe they're great, not elite players, and maybe they hold a ceiling in terms of what they can offer. If NIP wants to be a top 2 team in the league, maybe that's going to be a little bit more difficult with a player like Aki in the jungle, or if Shanji can't compete with a player like Flandre in the top lane, or with a bot lane like Foduk and Zhuo, who just really has no pressure unless they're given a ton of resources. Maybe all of those things are true, but there is still reason to believe that this is just one series against one of the top 2 teams, and when we see them go up against other, higher tier teams like Top Esports, like LNG, like Weibo, that NIP could actually continue to be incredibly relevant in those series. I'm not going to freak out. This is fine for now. I do want to see them get better, but at least for now, I'm not gonna go full panic mode just because they lost 2-0 in pretty dominating fashion to a team in JD Gaming that I think is elite. Top 2 is at the very least what they should be expecting. I think they consider themselves the best team in the LPL still from last year. With Flandre playing as well as he is right now, I mean, can I even really say anything otherwise? One of the big reasons why we were concerned about JDG was the rumored report that Sheer was starting in the top lane. But if you have Flandre showing up and being one of the best top laners, if Yagao is going to actually be able to carry through not only his macro but his mechanics as well. You have Kanavi, Ruler, and Missing, who are arguably all the best players individually in their positions. Who's to say this isn't the best team in the world right now? It certainly isn't going to be an argument I'm not making. Them, BLG, whoever you want to say, I think JDG has proven that they at the very least deserve to be in that conversation right now. And now moving on to day number 4, kind of our middle day here in the LPL, and we kicked it off with a matchup between ThunderTalk Gaming and OMG. And OMG picks up the 2-0 win. Good stuff from them. ThunderTalk was one of the teams that I was really going to be watching very closely over the course of this week, because after week 1, I think there was a real opportunity for them to make a case that they are a playoff team right now. Yucal looked amazing. 1xN and Chocho looked like they had very good chemistry, and Beishuan's always been known for his good shot calling, and so there was a world in which they came out here against an OMG team that really did not look all that clean with a lot of the roster, turmoil that they were going through, and they were just able to win and kind of cement themselves into that top 10, but that is not what happened here. OMG, planting their feet firmly in the ground, saying it was much too quick for anybody to be calling us not a playoff team just because we struggled a bit in 1 week of action. So we'll talk about that Player of the series is going to go to Abel. He is back in the lineup, thank God. I don't know why they took him out, but if there was ever any doubt as to whether or not Abel should be the starting AD carry for OMG, this series is it, man. I mean, the Tristana in Game 2, the Aphelios in Game 1 was also really good, but him and PP God just have very good chemistry together. Starry is just not ready to take this spot in the bot lane for OMG. Abel being back in here full-time, actually being able to play here against a team that they really needed to beat, and being able to come out and look as good as he does on his signature Tristana in the bot lane, it's really reassuring. It's a very, very good thing here. I don't know, maybe he is a two-trick. Maybe the Aphelios Tristana, the two champions that obviously we all know he plays at a very high level. Maybe you don't give them to Abel, but he got them in this series and he looked good. Until proven otherwise, he needs to be in this lineup. PP God looks significantly better with Abel next to him. He was actually really struggling mechanically to try and keep pace in the 2v2 with Starry. I just don't think they had very good chemistry or synergy. Maybe they didn't have a ton of time to practice together. I don't really know what the problem was, but thank God these two are back together, because honestly, I really do think this could save OMG's season. Another thing that I think has been a major positive for this OMG team, Zhao Feng in the jungle. Wow, he's really good. I did not see this coming. Didn't really love his LDL tape, the very limited bits that we saw of it. He actually didn't play a ton in Tier 2 in China. He was kind of the backup to Neu for Top Esports for a long time, and I just didn't really know if he was going to be somebody that could come in and make an immediate impact. I thought there would be some, growing pains, if you will, in the jungle position, but he's been awesome. They've played 4 series, and he's been a major impact in all 4. I'm really in on Zhao Feng right now. His tape so far is been spectacular, and he really did control this series. Beishuan has certainly not had a good start to this year, and a lot of the doubters are starting to prove themselves right, which I will talk about in a second when it comes to him, but Zhao Feng was definitely better, and I think that's a big positive. Angel, making some nice plays on the Nico, Q being fine in the top side, not dying at all on the Udyr. It's all good stuff. You just need those two to survive. Angel's a good player, but Cube was really bad in week number 1. Good to see him not make any mistakes and allow the rest of his team to actually win some games, because with Abel and PP God and a solid jungle, a solid mid laner here for OMG, this should be a playoff team, and I think they re-cemented that with this win. Then for Thunder Talk on the other side, Beishuan's just not good right now, man. He's going to get done of the series again here. I'm a Beishuan defender. I have been. I've actually been pretty notoriously a Beishuan defender. I get really frustrated when I see a bunch of people on the subreddit just constantly talk about how this team will never win with Beishuan in the jungle, but it's hard for me to deny that this has not been a very good start to the split. His mechanics are just lacking a bit. His early games in particular are just lacking a bit. If you're going to pick Poppy, if you're going to pick Vi, you need to be able to exert some level of pressure. You need to get some lane ahead, and with Yucal and 1xN and Chocho individually playing pretty well mechanically in week number 1, I want to see you playing towards those lanes more. Just didn't happen here. Now, it doesn't help that I think all of those players definitely took a step back. 1xN was miserable in game number 1. Chocho in general, I think, was just really bad in this series, but Beishuan's lack of pressure and lack of tempo in the jungle, I think, certainly hurts this team more than it helps this team, and I think that became very apparent in this series, and so I don't think Zhao Huangren's the answer. I want to make that abundantly clear. I still think that is still too rich. He's never been good at this level, and honestly, he's not been good at the LDL level either. I think there are a lot of junglers that are available right now that could be upgrades here. Tarzan is still out on the market. Shadow is still out on the market. There are options that I think you could potentially try out and bring in here that could potentially make this team a little bit more competitive, because right now I just don't know if Beishuan is the answer, but I also don't know if that answer is there internally for you either. So certainly something to monitor, but like I said, Yucal, 1xN, Chocho, none of them played particularly well, specifically Chocho, who I thought mechanically was really bad in this series, especially on the Rakan, a pick that he is pretty good at for the most part. He just didn't look good here. 1xM had a really bad game number 1, was a little bit better in game 2. And then Yucal, I certainly don't think had a pretty traditional performance. He's been amazing for this roster, but I'm willing to cut him a bit of slack. He has been so dominant over the past year or so that, having a couple of games where he's just kind of a guy, not even losing the game for them, I think is fine. Generally, though, Thunder Talk definitely showed more of their flaws here. If they don't, try something different, I think that this team is going to be fine. I mean, they did show a lot of good things in week 1, but they also showed some of their negatives, which I think were kind of shown again here in week number 2. And then for OMG, glad to see them at least right the ship a little bit in this one with Abel coming back in. Zhao Feng looks very legit. I think Angel's a very good player in the mid lane. If you can just get survivability out of Cube, who was miserable in week number 1 and miserable for most of last split, or summer split in 2023, then I think this team will actually continue to be good. Do I think they're going to push for top 6 like they did last year? Probably not. I think there is a little bit of a skill cap there, but at least they've shown that they're beating teams that are trying to compete for their bottom tier playoff spot. I think that's a really good sign for OMG. And then moving on to our second series of day 4 here, and it's another battle between some top teams that I'm really excited to talk about. LNG Esports taking on Weibo Gaming. And LNG picks up a very much needed win here. Honestly, they were a bit of the underdogs coming into this. Weibo had a significantly better week number 1, even though I kept LNG above them in my power rankings. This was really a matchup that I was really interested in seeing because I think it was going to give a lot of clarity and a lot of context to where both of these teams were at the moment. LNG really shit the bed in Demacia Cup, losing to Rare Atom in their only series at the tournament 3-1. And then they started off super slow. They really were not good at the beginning of week number 1. They were able to salvage some things down the stretch, but there were major concerns about whether or not this team needed time to develop. Well, they got their time because they came out here in week 2 against an undefeated Weibo team and they were able to take them down 2-1. Really good stuff. I don't think this hurts Weibo too much. I think there were definitely moments in this series that looked very good for them. They just didn't have the firepower to be able to keep up with 2 of the better carries in the entire world towards the back half of the series, and that inevitably eventually was kind of their downfall. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the series, pretty no-brainer. Gonna go to Gala. He was amazing here. That's Senna in Game 3. I mean, again, that champion is so overtuned at the current moment. She is so ridiculously strong in pro play. She does so much for her team, and she does a ridiculous amount of damage, and she controls laning phase at an incredibly high level, and we saw that. Gala was phenomenal in that Game 3, but it's not like he didn't do a lot in Game 2 either on the Varus. I mean, he was just really consistent across both of these games. When you need a player to bail you out of a tough spot, when maybe the rest of your team isn't playing up to standard, Gala is one of the best players in the world to do that just because of how consistent he is as a late game carry in that ADC role. So really good stuff coming in from him. Scout was also really good here, although he was very bad in game number 1 on the Akali. Definitely kind of rebounded with a really nice game 3 on the Azir, really nice game 2 on the Tristana. Good to see Scout actually have a good series. He was one of the players that I was concerned about after week number 1 because it very much felt like he was slow to get back into the groove of things after being the best regular season player in any major region last year. And so nice to see him, come back week number 2, get his head on his shoulders and bounce back to win that game 2, win that game 3, and look good in that. Weiwei was like a ridiculous 0-1-24 over the last 2 games of this series. That's awesome. Obviously, playing against his former team, the team he went to World Finals with last year, it's good that he got the last laugh, especially on the Maokai in game number 3. Zika was solid, Mark was fine, but this was Scout and Gala as carries, and Weiwei really being the primary facilitator, I guess, for them, dependent in each game, and that's a good sign for LNG. That's the way to win here. Scout and Gala are one of the scariest carry duos in the entire world. To be able to enable them and to get them on the same page and to kind of see them how they were at the end of last year, that's a really good thing to see, I would say, for LNG. But for Weibo, on the other side, dud of the series was actually really difficult. I gave it to Crisp because I think game 2 and game 3 were just not particularly great from him, but he solo won game 1 with his Blitzcrank hooks. Without him, they don't win that game. Like, yes, you're able to get a lot of gold on the Draven, and Light does a really good job capitalizing in the back half, but without that, the Blitzcrank hooks, like, Draven doesn't get super fed. And so I feel really bad giving him player of the series because he was the reason they won their only game this series, but he was the worst member of this team over the back half. Crisp can be at times a bit inconsistent. I'm still a big believer in Crisp, and I still am a defender that he is like a top 5-ish support in the world. I still think that he is somewhere within that conversation. It just wasn't exactly a perfect back half of this series. I think you could give dud of the series to Xiaohu in the mid lane, who has also started really slow, very similar to Scout. Xiaohu was actually the weakest part of this team in week 1. I think at least over both of their series. ZDZ obviously struggled in their first series, but was awesome in their second one. He really has not been able to take over in that same way. The Corki is just nothing. He's playing super slow. He's not winning lane. There are concerns here when it comes to Xiaohu and whether or not this is going to translate into him actually being a top tier mid laner for the rest of the year, but I don't think he was bad enough. I don't think he made enough, egregious mistakes and errors to get dead of the series. But again, if you wanted to give it to him for being the least consistent through all 3 games, I think that that's fair. Light was pretty good here. Got a lot of that KDA from game 1 on the Draven, but the Senna and the Kai'Sa, really not a lot he can do towards the back half of the series once Gala got super far ahead. Xiaohao, ZDZ, both kind of outplayed in their role. Xiaohao in particular, I think could have been better in this series against Weiwei. You were really looking for him to be the big breakout here. They decided to go for Xiaohao instead of Weiwei. I praise this decision in the offseason because I like Xiaohao more as a player, but Weiwei definitely had the last laugh in their first meeting against each other. Either way, I'm not freaking out about Weibo. This is a team that's always been relatively inconsistent. Their best players have never been perfect from game to game. Even without the Shy on this team, I still imagine that inconsistency is going to remain, and that's just kind of what you got here. They still were able to take a game off of LNG, who looked very good in this series, and so I'm not freaking out. They're 5-2 in terms of game score this series. This is still a very good Weibo team, but I think this is more encouraging as a win for for LNG. It's really nice to see them back on the right track. Scout and Gala looking good. Weiwei looking good. There are a lot of positives, I think, to take away from this. I kept them above Weibo in my power rankings specifically because this series was coming up. I'm glad to see that the faith in the team that I gave them last week was rewarded here. And now moving into day number 5, which of course is the start of our super days here in the LPL, our 3 series days instead of 2. And kicking off day 5, we had a matchup between Ninjas in Pyjamas and Team WE that NIP is going to be able to pick up a win in. This was a fun series. I think WE did at least a little bit to keep it interesting at the beginning. Obviously, game 1 was fun. Games 2 and 3, not so much. Kind of blowouts, really not close under any aspect, but still, at the end of the day, we can take a look and say at least they were able to win one of these games to stay at 500 in terms of their game score for WE, but NIP getting back on track after that loss to JD Gaming earlier in the week. This was really nice, and I think one of the more encouraging parts of this is that, you know, obviously Topside was struggling a bit in that series against JD Gaming, but they were the strength in week number 1 alongside Rookie. What I think is really encouraging is that beating WE here, it was honestly all the bot lane. Fodik and Juo looked really good. Juo's going to get my player of the series, but I think you could give this to Fodik as well. Whoever you think had more of an impact on this series, go ahead and give them your player of the series. It probably should be one of Fodik or Juo, but I think generally that is such an encouraging sign. Obviously, I'm super low on both of these players, notoriously low on Fodik, if you will, but I think this is a really good circumstance for them. I think Rookie coming back, obviously, really helped Fodik out. The last time that Fodik was playing with Rookie, he was a pretty interesting AD carry, one that I do think was a bit overhyped, but certainly one that I think had really good moments and, you know, wasn't necessarily in as bad of a spot without the resources as he was last year, but, you know, Juo was somebody who's never been able to stick on a main team here in the LPL. He got his opportunity on NIP. You can argue that last year was one of his better years in a while, even assuming that his bot lane was bad, which it was, but coming into this year, really the conversation surrounding NIP was always, topside's really good. If bot lane is just not the worst in the league, then this team's going to be fine. And actually, it's been better than that. Fodik and Juo have been pretty solid to start this split. Juo looking really good on the Rakan in particular in this series. A lot of really good engages. When you're an aggressive playmaker and you have the opportunity to go out and make plays like Juo was able to do in this game, all of a sudden you're going to look a lot better. I think he felt a lot more comfortable. Now it's worth noting he's going into Prince and Awandi in particular, who has not looked good over the past few weeks, but Juo definitely outplayed him in this series, and I think that's a really good sign. Fodik did a really good job of capitalizing on the creation of, you know, what the Rakan was doing, all the creative things that Juo was making for him. Obviously, Fodik capitalized on, but I think his positioning even showed some higher upside than that. Really aggressive positioning, being able to go out there and create his own advantages, especially in that third and final game. He was not playing around. Really good stuff from Fodik and Juo. Hopefully they can keep this up. I also want to give a big shout out to Aki. I thought Aki was a lot better in the series than he was earlier this week. Shanji continued to struggle. I'm not exactly sure if that's going to be something that we're going to have to monitor because Shanji has been so good over the past couple of years for OMG, but he was going into Wayward here, who is pretty hot right now. And while he struggled a bit more down the stretch when he wasn't on the Darius, it still is worth noting that the Kashanji wasn't nearly as good here as it was in week number 1. Certainly something to monitor, but Aki, really good. 3 games of Sedge. Rookie, really good, moving around the map, making sure bot lane's in a really advantageous position. Honestly, if I had to compare this game to something, it really did feel like 2022 Victory 5, which I think is a really good thing to say for Fodik. That is the one year where he has really looked like he can be one of the top 80 carries in the LPL, or at least a player that performs well when given a lot of resources and a lot of attention and a lot of help, and I think he got that in this game and performed up to that standard. That's going to need to stay consistent, or else this team is probably still going to struggle, but it's actually been a really encouraging first couple of weeks here, I would say, for the bot lane on NIP. And then for WE on the other side, very clear strengths, very clear weaknesses. Strengths, the solo lanes continue to look really good. Now, did they look as good down the stretch as this series really got out of hand? No, Wayward and Fofo weren't exactly ridiculously strong in that, but game number 1 was great from the Darius and from the Azir. Both Wayward and Fofo, I think, are going to be pivotal pieces for WE going forward. They've been the best performing members of this team by a large margin. I think Prince also was relatively fine, got to play a couple of games of Misfortune here, and while he wasn't able to generate any sort of early game tempo because Awandi played really bad, I do think that there was enough good here in order to not freak out. I still think the problem with Prince that I'm concerned about is the fact that a lot of his aggressive tendencies haven't exactly translated to the LPL. I would have thought this was a great league for a player like Prince, who loves to ego check 2v2 a lot in lane, or at least he has over the course of his career, but that has not been how he has played at all here. He's played very safe, very passive. At least for now, it's been a little bit of a detriment, even if his scoreline looks good here. And then the two players that have really struggled for WE continued to struggle here. Awandi played really bad in this series, especially on the Maokai in game number 3, where he just was completely useless. Maokai MF really needs to establish that tempo early, because you are not going to be in a good spot if you are having to play from behind against Zyrakan, and they just got absolutely destroyed. Awandi was constantly in bad positions and constantly taken advantage of, and then my dud of the series is going to go to Hang in the jungle. A great rookie year from him, or at least a really, really encouraging rookie year from him last year, in my opinion. Somebody that I really had high expectations for going into year 2. He's been pretty bad to start the second year of his career. The Mundo in game 3 here, I don't really know what that was. The Maokai was awful. He gets dud of the series because I think he was worse across both game 2 and game 3. I think Awandi was worse specifically in game 3, but Hang had really bad games in both, and I think he was essentially useless across this series. Aki was able to get pressure a lot early, and Hang, a player notorious for getting pressure early, just kind of got left in the dust, got snowballed out of this game. It's really, really not a good look. I mean, if this team is going to underperform, if WE is going to be not as good as people want them to be, it's going to be because Hang and Awandi right now are just not playing all that well. Prince needs to be more aggressive. I like what Wayward and Fofo are doing. Perhaps you would want them to be a bit more consistent, but they've actually been pretty good. They've been able to win lanes. I just think the ancillary pieces on this team, like Hang, like Awandi, need to get better if WE wants to be able to compete. This isn't the worst loss in the world. It's a good team in NIP that you lost to, but you probably would have wanted to go down at least in a better spot than this. But for NIP, solid series. If Fodak and Juo continue to look this good, especially after Rookie played so well in week number 1, this could be a very dangerous team. I put them into my top 4. I was rethinking that a bit after the JDG slaughter. I think I feel a lot better about that now after this win over WE. And then moving on to our second series of day 5, and remember when I talked about a free bingo space on everybody's LPL card? Well, I guess I was wrong. It wasn't everybody's free space. We're talking about Ultra Prime taking on FunPlus Phoenix, and Ultra Prime is able to pick up a win here. This is not something that I saw coming. This team has looked just as inept as I think we all anticipated them to look at the beginning of the split, and FPX was honestly looking okay. Even though their record was only 1-2, they were 3-4 in terms of game score, and it could have been a lot worse for them. Even some of the games that they lost, they looked okay in. You really weren't freaking out about this team. You certainly didn't think they were going to go into a series against Ultra Prime and lose, but that's exactly what happened here. Ultra Prime picking up their first win of the year, FPX dropping this series for no explicable reason, and you know, now I've got to cover it. I do want to talk about the positives and the negatives, because it's not like this was, you know, FPX screwing up. Ultra Prime did a lot of really good things in this series, and a couple of the players that did perform really well, I think are going to be worth pointing out, but still, it shouldn't have happened in the first place, so I guess we can talk about it. Player of the series is going to pretty easily go to Yuakai in the mid lane. Really happy to see him actually have a good series. When we're talking about players on this team that do have upside, he is one of the two that I look at and say, okay, I could reasonably see you figuring something out with this team and then moving on to bigger or better things when another organization inevitably offers you something. I think that is definitely possible for Yuakai. I don't exactly know if it's going to happen, but this was a good kind of preview that he still has some of the promise that he showed on Invictus a couple of years ago in 2024. I think we really needed to see this. The Azir game in game 1 was phenomenal. I thought he was really good in game 3 on the Corki as well. Funnily enough, really the only game where he didn't dominate was the Akali in game 2, kind of his signature pick. However, he still was really good. By far the best player on Ultra Prime in their loss in game number 2 was the one trying to keep that game close. We'll talk about his opposition in a second. He did not have a particularly good series, but I do think Yuakai was, you know, really good here. This was I don't want to say a top level performance or anything like that, but this showed that, you know, the promise and the potential that he had as a prospect coming up through the system, you know, 2 or 3 years ago is still there, at least to an extent. I just want to see it more consistently. I'm not even asking him to win a ton of games for this team, because I understand that that's going to be a little bit more difficult, maybe against teams that aren't running it down like FPX was at times in this series, but I want to see this kind of promise throughout the rest of this split before I really feel comfortable saying that Yuakai is back. I think it's also worth noting that I was higher a bit on this bot lane than other people were going into the year. I'm not quite as out on Doggo, although I'm pretty out on Doggo now. now, and I'm certainly not out at all on Jue. I think Jue is a really, really fun support prospect, one of the most interesting players on this team, and they had a very good series as well. Doggo performed incredibly well on the Lucian Nami. That might be something that they continuously go back to. I'm not exactly sure, but it certainly worked for Ultra Prime in this one, but Jue is just really good on everything, especially Enchanters. We know he's a good engager player. We saw it a ton in the LDL, but to see him be able to branch out and play Enchanters at a high level, it's definitely a positive to take away from this. So Yuukai, Doggo, Jue looking good. Decade Hacker looked fine here. They certainly outplayed their opponents. Maybe not so much Decade in game number 2, where he almost solo lost that game for his team, but, Hacker I thought was pretty good in this series. Definitely a nice bounce back and, a fun little matchup against his former org here in FPX. Generally, I think Ultra Prime actually just played well in these 3 games, especially game 1 and game 3, but game 2 really wasn't all that bad for them either. This was just generally a solid series for Ultra Prime, which I did not think that I was going to say. And then for FPX, this is a disaster. Losing to the worst team in the LPL is never a good look, and especially when one of your main players, kind of your core player on this team, ends up underperforming so much. Dud of the series is going to go to Care. I've been a Care defender for a little while. I think he's been underrated when it comes to this team and, keeping them relevant over the past couple of years, because I really wasn't a fan of the bot lane in a lot of the iterations of FPX that we've been getting, but he's had a very slow start to 2024. It's not really been that good of a look. Getting outplayed pretty consistently by Yuukai, even in the game that they won, is not a great sign. I just think Care needs to be better. He's always been a player that's been a little bit more on the let's scale into late game, I don't need to be super aggro right now kind of side. Like, he's not someone that's going to completely change and take over a game, but I compared him a lot to a player like Shanks that I think a lot of people really like at the current moment. I don't think Care has been living up to that billing in 2024. He has played a lot worse, and I think that was very clear in this series. I think Milky Way also probably had his worst series as an LPL pro up until this point. Just not a very good series going up against Hacker, who's really not a great jungler and not having any pressure, not having any prio, and losing very quickly, getting games snowballed by 10 minutes. I still like Milky Way, but it's a growing pain, right? Xiao Lao was really good on the Gnar in game 2 and really miserable when he got to play anything that required skill expression, like the Jax and the Fiora in games 1 and 3. And Ductum and Life were generally fine. I actually think they were probably the best part of this team over the course of this series, but, they haven't been particularly great to start the year. Dectum's been pretty good, but Life has not been great for FPX. I think there are reasonable concerns. This was a team that did feel like they could be, kind of an interesting team, maybe somewhere around 12 or 13, competing for one of those top 10 spots. After this, I am significantly lower on FPX and their upside than I was before this series. And for Ultra Prime, maybe they're not the worst team in the league. Being able to actually pick up a pretty clean win here, looking good, having good macro, executing well on your advantages, that's a really good sign. There are teams in this league that have looked completely inept, and Ultra Prime might have looked like that up until this point, but this is better than, what Rare Atom or Edward Gaming have shown up until this point in terms of, what they have offered on the Rift. I'm not necessarily saying that I'm guaranteeing that this team is better than them or will be higher than them in the power rankings, but this was just about as good of a look for a team that's been written off as you could possibly get right now. And then moving on to Series 3 of day number 5 here, another pretty interesting contest between Anyone's Legend and LGD Gaming, that AL is going to be able to take LGD's overperformance at the beginning of this split. Doesn't exactly end here because they still are able to take a game from AL, which I think generally is still a good indicator, and game 2 was very close. There was a world in which LGD was able to take that game if a couple of things go a bit different towards the back half, but AL, if luckily able to avoid disaster here, and they're able to pick up their second series win of the year. Going 2-2, still under 500 because they were able to lose a game here. They're 4-5, but in a better spot, I would say. This is about where we thought AL would be at this point in the split. They've been able to beat the teams that they should beat and lose to the teams that they probably should lose to, but generally, I think it's kind of in the way that we all expected it to. There really isn't a lot of analysis I can give to AL that I haven't already stated in some other videos, and so I might go through this one a bit quicker. Player of the series is going to go to Shanks. It's nice to see Shanks perform well in this series. He hasn't exactly been the pinnacle of consistency at the start of this year, and so nice to see him go up against a player in Haichao that actually has been very good to start 2024 and just kind of outperform him. Haichao was pretty good for most of this series. We'll get into that, but was really bad down the stretch in game number 3, and Shanks in game 2 just popped off. I mean, he went sicko mode, and he was able to end this game very quickly. The damage that Azir can do as a champion is pretty ridiculous when you get a lot of gold, when you get really far ahead on that champion, but credit to Krako. He is a very important part of this team, and he did really well in game number 3 to create a lot of those chances on the rail. Even in game 2, he did a great job to set up a lot of those Azir, triple kills that Shanks was getting towards the back half of the game. Generally good stuff, I would say, from the jungle mid duo. It's become very clear watching Anyone's Legend that Krako is the most important player on this team. When he plays well, this team wins. When he does not play well, this team loses. It is very, very apparent that they really rely a lot on him being able to generate a lot of pressure early in games in the jungle, or alternatively, his very good team fighting. I think obviously he can do both at a high level. We've seen Krako be one of the more interesting junglers in the world in the LCK, but a lot of this season is going to be on him and his consistency, because Harry is just kind of a guy in the top lane. He really has not taken that next step. He still is pretty interesting in lane, but I would argue less interesting than he was last year, and he certainly has not made any strides in terms of being able to take over in the teamfight stage, which was always a weakness of his as a player. And Hope and Kale are just kind of a bot lane. It reminds me a ton of Hope and Awandi from last year, at least in terms of how they played through the first couple of weeks. I think Kale should be better than Awandi as a player, but so far, Hope has kind of just been that weak side AD carry that he kind of has been over the course of his entire career. Jungle mid feels very important to AL, and that became very clear in this series. For LGD on the other side, really nice game number 1. Really loved how this team played that. Meteor, Haichao, Kepler even, all played really well in that first game. It was the rest of this series that ended up becoming a problem. Dud of the series is going to go to Kepler for me. Maybe I'm being too hard on the guy. Let me know down in the comments if you really disagree with the ferocity with which I talk about this, but Kepler is actively costing this team games by being the starting AD carry. I don't know if there are other potential replacements available for him at the current moment, but he's just not an LPL caliber player at the moment. He has been miserable. Really, the only reason that this team is sitting at 2-2 at the current moment and not 3-1 in this series is because Kepler made some pivotal errors down the stretch of game 2. He was okay throughout most of that game, but he just positions way too aggressively, and he just does not have the mechanics to be able to back up how he plays. I think the Kalista was awful in game 3. Again, maybe I'm being too hard on him. Maybe you could sit here and look at Haichao jumping in on the Tristana in game 2 and getting blown up in the mid game as a really big turning point for why they lost that game, but Kepler playing so bad in this one was really, really problematic for LGD, and I just don't know if this team is ever going to be all that competitive when they have him as their AD carry. He's just not very good. Jin Zhao, already had his one obligatory good series of the split, and so he was just kind of there. He was still okay, I would say, in this series, but certainly wasn't great. Meteor was really good in game 1 on the Maokai and did try to make things interesting in games 2 and 3, but generally was also a little bit overmatched by how good Krako was playing. And Bertle, I like in the top lane. I think he has generally been very good for this team. Hasn't necessarily gotten a ton of credit for it, but I still like Bertle. I think Haichao's having a good split, even if he was a bit outmatched in this one by Shanks. Meteor is a similar player. Kepler is just a little bit of a problem for this team. If bot lane continues to be the worst lane that basically anybody has in the league, I think, that's going to be an issue. Kepler right now is the worst player in the LPL, and that's really not what you want to see if you're an LGD team. Still, they're still overperforming. 2-2 right now is probably better than they expected to be going into week number 3, and so pretty solid week, I would say, overall for LGD, even if things didn't exactly go their way in this series. And then for AL, again, good win. Krako and Shanks are so important towards this team if they can continue their hot start. If Krako can kind of not have those negative moments like we saw earlier in the week, I think this team's going to be just fine. I think this could potentially even be a playoff team, but that consistency has to be there. Shanks is a very talented carry. I would love to see Kale get involved more in the cross-map play here, but right now, very much about the jungle mid duo, and that's at least going to be good in the short term if they're facing off against teams that have a bit of a talent disadvantage like LGD does. And now we get to move on to day number 6. Our weekend kicks off with a pretty interesting matchup, top team versus bottom team, as we saw Top Esports take on Rare Atom, and Top Esports is going to pick up the 2-0 series win here. Again, good for TES to get this 2-0 win. They dominated this series. Neither of these games were close. I think it was like a grand total of almost 50 minutes in this series. Not particularly good for Rare Atom, and this team just looks completely lost. They have lost every single game that they have played so far in 2024, at least as soon as the season has started, and they've really not looked competent in any of these games. A couple of these players have had good moments, but as a team, as a unit, they've looked like the worst team in the LPL, and I just don't know what else to say at this point. This is not looking good for Rare Atom, but it is looking good for Top Esports, who obviously didn't start off the season as great as they would want. They did drop to Bilibili, which is not a bad loss by any stretch if you're going to drop to one of the top 2 teams. You know, I'm really not going to complain about that too much. Nice bounce back later on in the week against EDG, and here another good win against Rare Atom. Both of their wins are against 2 bad teams at the current moment, the only 2 teams in the LPL without a win at the current moment, or at least in terms of series score, but, you know, at the very least, they were able to dominate both of those series in the way that you would expect. Player of the series for me is going to go to Tion in the jungle. Nice to see him have a little bit of a bounce back performance. He really underperformed in that Bilibili series. He was the one I was most concerned about after that series because he tends to be a bit more inconsistent as a player. He'll have good moments and bad moments, but he dominated this series over a jungler who's just really struggling to adapt to the LPL in Neu. So much prio generated by the Rel, so much prio generated by the Poppy. It really just was a fantastic performance coming in from Tion. He was the facilitator that set up everything that Top Esports was doing throughout this series. So credit to him. He's absolutely player of the series. I think you could also consider someone like Jackie Love player of the series here. The Senna, the Lucian, both of them looking really good. It's nice to see the 2 players coming back here on Top Esports looking phenomenal in this series. You know, Mako was great, I think, especially on the Tom Kench. Went deathless throughout the entire series. That's really fun. Cream got his pentakill here. He has looked pretty good in the 2 series ever since that Bilibili series. He didn't exactly create his own advantages all that much in the series, but he did a very good job of capitalizing when Tion or when Mako or when Jackie Love would be able to set something up. And that's all you really need him to do. Again, you just need him to be a strong mid laner. You need him to be a top 5-ish mid laner in the league, and this is the kind of performance that a top 5 mid laner would put out. 369 was definitely better on the top side of this map. Overall, Top Esports dominated this. This wasn't particularly close. There really isn't a lot of analysis I can give you. They won from minute 5 in both of these games and just snowballed it out of control. They were the better team, and it continues to look like they will be near the top of the standings, regardless of that week 1 loss that they ended up suffering to maybe the best team in the world right now. And then for Rare Atom, like I said, 0-4, 0-8. This is just about as bad as you could possibly draw it up. In fact, this is as bad as you could draw it up. Again, Vikla really the only one showing any signs of life on this team in week 2, which is funny because he was by far the worst performer on this team in week number 1, and so you're really not excited about that. I guess Xiaoshu showed a little bit more here. He has struggled with his ability to continuously dominate, game to game to game. He was very inconsistent in spring of last year. A lot of people saw a lot of breakout potential with him on LGD. Obviously, eventually goes to Rare Atom in summer and actually gets a lot better, really starts to realize a lot of that potential, but he still is a very young player, and especially on a bad team, you're not expecting him to be perfect. And so while this is probably the best series that he's played over the course of this year so far, still wasn't perfect, but everybody else on this team was just awful. Dead of the series is obviously going to go to Neu. I was so high on this guy going into the LPL this year. I really did think he was going to be the big breakout rookie because his LDL tape was so phenomenal. He was the best player at tier 2. I thought he was going to adapt and adjust really well, but it has just not been good for him. He has yet to be able to find any sort of tempo, whether it's on tanky engagers like the Maokai or whether it's on early game aggressors like the Lee Sin. Both look equally as bad, and I think that's a terrifying thing to say. I don't really know what the problem is because he honestly is not generating any tempo. He was so good in the early game in the LDL that I really don't know what to tell you the major issue is at the current moment. I just know that things are a problem and he is not currently good enough to be a starting jungler in the LPL. Hopefully that can adapt and change. Assume and Zora are just a bad bot lane. Like, there really is no other way to say it. Assume is miserable in terms of positioning and in terms of actively getting involved in any of the plays that his team is making. Zora has been a bottom 1 or bottom 2 support in the league so far this split. Again, I still don't really know why he's starting in here over Xiaoxi, but Rare Atom's a disaster. I mean, right now, this is the worst team in the LPL. I don't really know how we got here because they really have no business being this bad. They have so much talent. They're just not capable of putting it together for more than one game. Even one game, right? They haven't won one game, let alone a series. They're 0-8 in game score. They're 0-4 in series score. Everything has gone wrong for this team. They have no idea what to do. All of their lanes are losing. They have no prio in the jungle. It just is really bad for them. This team is garbage, and I can't explain to you why that is, but it just kind of is the truth right now. And then for Top Esports, obviously this team is still really good. Do I think they're going to live up to that number 3 power ranking? At least right now, I feel pretty good about that, especially with the competition around them not looking perfect. Ninjas in Pyjamas dropping that series to JD Gaming, but Top Esports is talented enough to be able to go head-to-head with anybody. They were able to take a game off of BLG, which is enough to tell me that this is a pretty good team. Their schedule is going to get harder. They've played the 2 winless teams so far outside of BLG, and so, it's not like they've had the toughest schedule in their 2 wins, but once things start to get a little bit more challenging, I think we're going to get a better idea of where this team wants to allocate some of its resources. And then moving on to our second series of day 6 here, and this one was very telling for me personally. It was Invictus Gaming taking on ThunderTalk Gaming, and Invictus picking up a really nice win here, moving to 3-1 to start this split. I was talking about how I needed to see more from IG after last week. They looked okay, but their only win was against Ultra Prime, and that really didn't make me feel all that good. But they come into this week, and they look really good. They take down Rare Adam, who obviously doesn't look great right now, but still, you know, at least has interesting players. But most importantly, they take down ThunderTalk here, who by the end of week number 1 was looking like a potential playoff team if things continue to go right. UCal was really good. 1xN looked like he was progressing, but things have kind of fallen off the rails for this team. Things are going wrong for them at the current moment, and Invictus is kind of capitalizing on that, which I think is really big. I'm still not sold on the upside of this team, but their floor is clearly higher than other teams around them in the league at the current moment. Let's talk about it. Player of the series was kind of difficult. I'm going to give it to You Should Know Me for the consistency that he showed over the course of this series. I thought he was the one who definitely had the biggest impact while also not giving away free advantages in the games that they weren't playing well in. Shout out Cryan, who we will talk about. Again, Cryan very much is the focal point for this IG team. They have made that abundantly clear through their first 4 series that they want to play through mid lane. They want to play through Cryan, but, you know, sometimes he gives over a lot of advantages. Shout out the Talia game in game number 2. So, player of the series is going to go to You Should Know Me for kind of being very consistent. Still great, especially on the Cassante in game number 1, where he was able to generate most of his advantages, but the Yones were still solid, especially in game number 3, where he really was able to do a lot of good work. It's nice to see him have a nice performance. I don't think this is akin to some of the breakout, showings that he showed last year, where at the beginning of spring, he was really dominating people, going up 40, 50 CS, and being able to translate that into major split push advantages and just macro leads for his team. Obviously, those aren't able to be generated in the same way now, but he has, I think, gotten a little bit better at playing within structure. Towards the end of spring, we saw him get countered a bit more. We saw IG really fumble their way out of a playoff spot, and a lot of that was because You Should Know Me really struggled at playing within structure and playing that front-to-back team fight 5v5 stage and playing meta picks. He really wasn't good at that last year, and he's become a lot better at that. The Cassante was amazing, and the Yone, I think, functioned in that role very well. So credit to You Should Know Me. Like I said, Cryan was still really good, especially in game 3, the closeout game of this series on Azir. That really is his signature champion right now. Was really bad on the Talia in game 2, but the only thing that really costs him is player of the series here. He still is the focal point of everything this team wants to do. When they have the opportunity to play through him, they will play through him. They have shown that. On and Wink were also just straight up better as a bot lane in this series. They've kind of gotten back to where they were last year for the most part, which is a pretty good bot lane, like an upper half bot lane for sure. They were very consistently in that range for most of 2023. Nice to see them continue that in 2024 after a rough week number 1, if we're being honest. But, Tianjin creating advantages, dying a lot, did try to flip some games. The Jarvan game in game 2 was really, really not good, but for Invictus, it ended up not mattering too much. I think this team has really solidified some of the mistakes and errors that they've made. Makes a lot of sense. The continuity that they bring with all 5 members coming back, I think, has really helped them at the beginning of this split, and we're seeing that advantage, I think, going up against a team that, while they also stayed pretty much the same, did bring in a new member in the support position who really did not perform super well towards the back half of this series. So we'll talk about it. Dud of the series is still going to go to Beishwan in the jungle. I really hate to just continue to pile onto a player that I do think has had really good performances in the past, but it just does not feel like he is playing well in 2024. I have to be willing to admit that. The Maokai looked miserable in game number 3. I do think he looked great in game 2, but everybody kind of looked good for ThunderTalk in game 2. He did a good job of generating advantages, taking advantage mostly of the mistakes that Tianjin was making on the other side of the map, which are kind of, regular errors for him. Maybe not so much in 2024, but they were last year. And Chocho obviously did a lot of really good work on the Ashe, but ironically enough, the 2 best players in game 2 in Beishwan and Chocho were the 2 worst players throughout the rest of the series. Specifically in game 3, that Tahm Kench was miserable. I think it was worse than Beishwan's Maokai. I think he did significantly more damage to his team, but I think Chocho was also a bit better in game number 2, and so he ends up getting the dud of the series. Beishwan does. I think you could realistically give this to Chocho. I just think that Beishwan was probably more deserving if you're taking all 3 games into account. Either way, UCal continuing to look really good, and Hoya having the best series that he has had in a very, very long time. This is a player who, over the course of 2023, really cemented himself as a bottom 2, bottom 3 top laner in the LPL, just completely fell off after really starting strong for ThunderTalk. He did not play very well down the stretch of 2023, and it didn't feel like anything was really going to change this year. There wasn't a lot of reason to believe that, but this was a pretty good performance. I think, honestly, there were times where he looked looked better than You Should Know Me. I think You Should Know Me was better in team fights and certainly was more consistent throughout the whole series, but Hoya actually played really well, and UCal continues to just win matchups, like, no matter what. Even when Cryan is playing well, UCal is still very relevant in a lot of these games. 1xN's positioning was very passive, especially on the Ezreal and the Senna. Wanted to see a bit more from him in this series, but overall, ThunderTalk's problems are more to do with the fact that they just need to capitalize on enemy mistakes. It doesn't feel like they're very good at pressuring. It doesn't feel like they're very good at setting their own tempo. They really do a good job of making, you know, I guess, plays out of the enemy's bad plays. I think that is something that we're going to continue to monitor, but at least for now, ThunderTalk not really looking like the team I thought they were coming out of week one. And then for Invictus, maybe they are the team that I thought ThunderTalk was coming out of week one. I still think this team has a rather low ceiling because I just don't really know how many of these players are going to break out, but Cryan's playing really well. If You Should Know Me can kind of grow in structure, Tianjin gets a little bit more consistent. If On and Wink can take over as a really good bot lane like they were for parts of spring last year, I mean, this absolutely could be a playoff team. They're certainly on pace to be a playoff team right now, but they were on pace to be a playoff team last spring and they fumbled that. So really interested to see where things go, but once again, this is a very good start for Invictus. And then moving on to our third series of day 6, it was an undefeated team versus a winless team, Bilibili Gaming taking on Edward Gaming. And Bilibili does pick up the win. There is no major upset to talk about here. It's a 2-0 domination. Again, 2 games that both are under 25 minutes coming in here. So a very, very quick series. And BLG takes care of what they should take care of. Now, there is something to be made note of here. EDG does have another roster substitution. Solo Kill obviously came in for Ale earlier in the week. Now, Leave is out and the Snake is in. We saw this a bit last year before they signed Uzi. The Snake came in and played, some games to fill the gap between when Uzi was able to come in and obviously, when Leave had to leave. But now Leave is being, taken off of this team for performance reasons, and the Snake is back in. So I guess we'll have to see how he does. Not a pretty fair shake in game number 1 here because he has to face Bilibili Gaming, maybe the best team in the world right now, but, at the very least he's in there. So for BLG, what ended up happening? Well, player of the series goes to Shun. He got Kindred. Yeah, good for you, man. It is genuinely so fun to watch June, on the rare game where he actually gets to play carries, because he just pops off every time. He does so well. Obviously, he's known for his Nidalee, but things like the Kindred and the Graves have always very much been in his pocket. Back when he was on Invictus, he got to play these champions more. He's kind of fallen into a more engaged style role here on BLG just because of the rest of the team around him. They're all so aggressive. Elkin Honor's so aggressive. Knight wants to play aggressive, and so Shun obviously is the one that kind of takes the role to be able to set them up because he is very good at these engaged style junglers, but when he gets to play that Kindred game, man, does it look good. He's getting player of the series for that. He still was very good on the rel in game number 1. I don't want to take that away from him, but he really is getting this for game number 2. I want to give a big shout out to On in the support position. He's been the best support in the LPL to start this year. Hasn't gotten any player of the series awards because he just is on a team with Knight and Shun, who are playing amazing right now as a duo. They complement each other really, really well, but On has been spectacular. He continued to look great, especially on the Nautilus in game number 1. Again, when he gets to play anything that can be super aggro, can go in and create his own action, he looks like one of the best supports in the world. On continues to look amazing here. Elk capitalized on everything On and Shun were able to make, especially in game number 1, and Knight really doesn't make a lot of mistakes. He's a great setup player. People honestly underrate him as a secondary carry, not a primary, resource-heavy guy. He obviously can be, and he's very good at that. He has been that for this team throughout the split, or the year up until this part. But he's also really good when he gets to play low resource because he's really smart at setting up a lot of these flank angles and making sure the other carries on the team are in a good position. Sometimes he is a little bit too overeager in terms of Nico engages or things like that, but for the most part, he's really, really good in this role, and we saw it here. I know a lot of people criticize Knight for being somebody who needs resources in order to win. I don't necessarily see him as that kind of player. I don't think he's proven to be that kind of player. Bin was a little bit whatever on the top side. He was the better top laner by far. He dominated laning phase, but didn't really have to. The games were over by the time top lane ever became relevant. And so for Bilibili, this was a really good series. Shun and Knight have amazing chemistry as a duo. On is playing out of his mind at the current moment. And if Elk and Bin are the 2 players on your team that I'm talking the least about through your first 4 series, That's insane. Like, that's how good this team is playing at the current moment. But it's basically the opposite for EDG. 0-4 start. They're not 0-8. They are 1-8, which I guess is good. They were able to take that game off of RNG in week number 1. But no matter what combination of players this team tends to go for, I don't think it's getting better. In fact, I think you're getting worse by going for these changes. Solo kill coming in. Don't really know what they're doing there. Obviously, I think it's just a rebuilding year. Same thing with the Snake. I guess, Leave was kind of on his final leash very quickly with this team, and they were very willing to kind of change him out. But the players on this team that have been the problem are not out of here. Players like Fisher and Vampire have not been good. Vampire is one of the worst players in the LPL, full stop. He certainly has been over the course of this split. And your new addition, like I said, Solo Kill, he's done of the series here. I mean, Udyr, Cassante gets destroyed in lane down 20, 30 CS regularly, and then goes into team fights and just insta-dies. I don't know what to tell you, man. Like, it's not particularly good. I know it's Bin, and I know Bin makes a lot of top laners look silly, but this was bad. Like, Solo Kill continues, I guess for the first time, looks bad, and that's not a good sign. Jejes, whatever, he got to play Nocturne, but Kindred got mega fed on the other side, and so that champion became instantly useless. Fisher continued to look better, I would say, in week 2 than he looked at any point in week 1, where he was immediately outmatched by everybody he went up against, but at least in week 2, he was competent. The Snake didn't really get to do anything. Can you name something that he did in these 2 games on the Xayah? He didn't capitalize on anything. Vampire did. He didn't capitalize on an engage that the Vi made in game number 1. Just kind of stood around and auto-attacked and, sometimes picked up some kills, but for the most part, just was kind of useless. And like I said, Vampire is bad. EDG is just not a good team, and it feels like they're getting worse and worse every single game, which is the exact opposite of what you want to hear. This is probably the worst EDG team of all time, and I think that is almost more impressive than them being one of the better teams and to come out of this and actually be a playoff team. I certainly had them too high at number 10 in my preseason power rankings, and that has absolutely become apparent. But for BLG on the other side, they're playing amazing, arguably the best team in the world right now. Again, they're just so stacked in all 5 roles. It's really hard to imagine a world in which this team starts to struggle. People were concerned about potential playstyle issues with Knight coming into the mid lane, but everything has worked out so far, even against good teams. I'm not worried at all about Bilibili Gaming. This is the team I thought they would be, and they very much have earned their spot, number 1 in the power rankings. And that's going to bring us to our 7th and final day of LPL action here in week number 2. Thank you guys so much for sticking around this long if you have made it to this part of the video. But kicking off our final day of week 2 action, it was a matchup between OMG and Ninjas in Pyjamas that NIP is going to be able to take in 2 games. What the hell happened to OMG's brains in this series? I don't know what to say, because this is just a very weird series to try and analyze. OMG decided to lose, eventually through game 2. Now, they lost game 1 pretty handily. I'm not going to sit here and say that they were really doing well before they just decided to turn their brains off, but man, did they turn their brains off at the end of that second game. They ran it down over and over and over again, basically gave NIP some free score lines. Really nice of them to do that, but this was bad from OMG. This was good from NIP, who continues to look like a top team against everybody that's not one of the top 2 teams who feel pretty locked in. But, I mean, this team looks great right now. Player of the series, yeah, it's going to go to Fodic. I might say something controversial. I don't know how people feel about this, but is this the best Fodic has ever looked through 2 weeks of games? 2-week stretch. Give Fodic a 2-week stretch. Has he ever had a 2-week stretch that looks like this? I know I'm significantly lower on his 2022 with Victory 5 than everybody else is. I know I constantly talked throughout that year about why I thought he was so overrated as a player in the summer split, but I'm buying in right now. The mechanics are there. The confidence is there. I'm really happy to see that. Rookie came back here because he trusted Fodic and he trusted Juo, and he wanted to play with Fodic in particular. And so to see that work out for them, I think is massive for this team. I really question that decision in the offseason, not only because Fodic was bad last year, but because I've never really seen him as the superstar that some of the other LPL analysts has said he could be. But, Fodic has kind of proven me wrong right now. He has been great to start this split. And so has Juo. I honestly think Juo is going incredibly underrated right now. He absolutely got robbed on player of the game in one of these games. The Tom was so important towards what this team wanted to do in terms of being super aggro and creating so much space for the actual damage dealers to operate, whether that was the Senna, whether that was the Talia, hell, whether it was the Udyr in game number 2. I think the Tom really did a lot of the heavy lifting. Juo has looked great. Fodic and Juo as a duo have looked very good to start this split. They were the concern, and the concerns are gone, which is why I feel so confident in NIP right now. Shanji really got his groove back after kind of a rough series earlier in the week against Flandre. Really nice to see him play 2 good games of Udyr, especially that second game where he was genuinely unkillable. This was a signature Shanji performance. Dominate lane, run it down in team fights, never die, 1v5, completely run over the series. So good stuff from Shanji. Rookie continues to look awesome on this team that he wanted to come back to. Aki was a great signing to enable a lot of these playmakers that you have around the team. Just generally, I think NIP is constructed in a really smart manner, and I think they have earned a top 4 spot in the power rankings. This has very much cemented my opinions on that. But for OMG, what the hell happened here, man? Like, where did this go? Is it PP God? He's obviously the shot caller for this team, and, you know, he's good friends with Fodic, he's good friends with Rookie, he's played with them in the past. Was this just kind of a little wink, wink, nudge, nudge? Here's a free win, buds? Like, I don't know what the hell happened in this game. They just turned off their brain. This is some of the worst decision-making I've ever seen on a micro level. I don't even know how to explain it. Dud of the series was honestly difficult. Cube, Xiaofeng, Abel, PP God, give it to any of them. Give it to any of those 3. The only person it can't be is Angel, who I think was generally fine in this series on the Akali, certainly was trying to make plays, but man, everybody else was miserable for them. I'm giving it to Cube because what the hell was that Rumble in game number 2? How do you just get consistently run down by Udyr and not adjust your game plan or your strategy or your positioning at all? Like, I don't know what happened. Cube's descent, I think, has been very well documented on this channel. He has not been very good the past year or so, and I think that very much continued here. Xiaofeng probably had his worst series in the LPL, especially on that Jarvan in game 2, which was a disaster, and I can't even explain what happened with Samira Rakan in game 2. I don't even know. Rakan Wing in, hitting a knockup and instantly dying like 5 different times. PP God literally felt like he was win trading in this, and Abel certainly didn't change that opinion with some weird Samira engages. I just don't know what happened to OMG in this one. They all played like garbage, and I guess that's just what you get, right? This is a team that feels like they are going to be kind of the barometer. If you can beat OMG, you're probably a good team. If you lose to OMG, you're probably not a good team. They feel like kind of the measuring stick for the middle of the LPL at the current moment. Unfortunately, that probably makes them a playoff team in terms of how the LPL is currently constructed, because I really do think there's only 8 good teams in the LPL right now, but if OMG continues to play like this, they're not going to be a top 10 team. This was a miserable performance. For now, I'm not going to overreact. I'm going to say it was just 2 games, and most specifically game 2 where they looked miserable, but this is not the kind of encouraging performance you want to see so early on into a season. And then for NIP, again, this team looks really good. It feels like they're very complete, especially if Fodic and Jua are going to play like this throughout an entire split. I really trust Shanji, Aki, and Rookie in this bot lane has stepped up in a major, major way right now. NIP looks just as scary as anybody could have anticipated this offseason. Then moving on to our second series of day number 7 here, and it's a rematch of the LPL Summer Finals from 2023 from last year. It's JD Gaming taking on LNG Esports, and JDG is going to repeat that performance from last year with another win here, a 2-1 win. LNG is actually able to take game 1 in pretty convincing fashion, but JDG looking really good right now. They feel very complete as a roster. It feels like everybody is pulling their weight, and like I said for BLG, it very much feels like a top 2 in the LPL right now between them and JD Gaming. And I think generally that's kind of what we expected going into the year, but it very much has played out as that at the start of this year. To LNG's credit, they looked significantly better than they did in week number 1. There was concerns with this team. I was very cautious with this team because they looked so bad at Demacia Cup, and they also were underperforming in the first week of the season. There were a lot of reasons to be a little bit more passive about, saying that this was just going to work out, that the changes that they made were instantly going to be positive, but I still think this team is fun to watch. I just think they're a very different team than what they were last year. We'll get into that when we talk about LNG, but JDG, a lot of good to talk about. Player of the series was honestly a little difficult because, again, everybody's so freaking good on this team. I'm going to give it to Kanavi in the jungle. Felt like the Xin Zhao games were really demonstrative of just how he can take over a game super quickly. His macro is immaculate. I mean, truly, he is always in the right place at the right time, and maybe that's because he creates what the right place is, with good plays and just generally by outplaying his opponents, but he is always where he should be, and I think that is a skill that is so commendable that most other junglers just don't have. Weiwei really struggled with that in this series. We will get to that. Kanavi was massive in terms of being able to not only generate leads for himself, but generate leads for his team, secure objectives, and just generally be amazing. He is Kanavi. He's the best jungler in the world, and he proved that again in this series. Flandre looks fantastic. He looks just as good as he did at the peak of his EDG times. I mean, I know it's only really been 1 week of dominant performances from him, but I'm all in on Flandre if he's going to play like this. Okay, great stuff. Ruler and Missing are spectacular. Still one of the best bot lane duos in the world. They dominate in the mid game like nobody else. Both of these players are uniquely skill set oriented in to take over the mid game, the part of the game that LNG was supposedly supposed to be the best at, what they were really good at last year. That's what Ruler and Missing shut down and destroy at an incredibly high level. It makes them very difficult to end up playing against, and Yagao is kind of the glue that pieces everything together. Still is a very good carry. He outputs damage at a very, very high level because he's very clinical about his positioning and when he goes in team fights, but really what he does in the early game to enable players like Kanavi and Missing to play super aggro is super important towards this particular JDG playstyle. Again, they play much more similarly to 2022 JDG than they do 2023 JDG, but both of those teams were semifinalists at Worlds, and so it's not a bad comparison to say that this is a team that could potentially get there or get beyond that for sure. And then for LNG, you know, this is an interesting squad because I think there are some reasons to believe that this is very similar to what they were last year and also very different to what they were last year. I think the fundamental idea has very much changed, and I know I've talked about this a lot on the channel, but I think in terms of explaining why I believe that, Weiwei's dud of the series, and I think this is a good example of why I always consider Tarzan super underrated for this team. Weiwei and Tarzan are similar players in isolation. I think they would get similar grades as I gave in my offseason video. They're basically, you know, same players in terms of value. Tarzan maybe not as flashy as Weiwei, but really what Tarzan added to this team was a level of consistency that Weiwei just doesn't add. What Weiwei does is a lot of these more short-term decisions, and I don't mean that in a negative way. That can be very positive in order to generate leads and start getting games snowballed out of control. Really allow your team to push the tempo and push the pace and really play fast and aggressive. Weiwei does that just about as well as any other jungler in the world, but in the process of doing that, he takes more 60-40 plays than, you know, Tarzan would have on this team, which means that these players need to be ready and willing to adapt to those plays, and it just inherently is going to introduce more volatility to the team and to the individual players. LNG was so good last year because they were constantly ahead mentally of every team that they were playing. They were taking 4v3s. They were at every objective first. Their tempo and their macro were better than almost anybody else in the LPL, even when they had lackluster players like LP in pivotal carry roles. Obviously, you know, Scout was amazing last year, but a big reason why Scout was so amazing last year was because the advantages that LNG was able to generate for him, the positions that that team was able to put him in, and also that he put himself in, were significantly better than the positions that other players of similar or even better skill sets were being put in by their teams, including the top teams like JDG and Bilibili Gaming. That's why Scout was able to take advantage of so many opportunities, and that's why he looked so good in specific circumstances, and why it didn't necessarily hold up as much when other teams were able to just counteract that style in the mid game. That's where I think LNG has been struggling a bit to start the season. I know it's kind of in-depth analysis, but that's what I hope to offer on this channel. Weiwei is a good player, but I think the tempo and the style that he plays with is not necessarily gelling well with players like Scout and Gala, specifically Scout right now in the same way that it did with Tarzan. This is still a very good team. I just don't know if they're going to be the elite team that they were with very complementary skill sets last year. They were more than the sum of their parts last year. I think there's an opportunity for them to be less than that this year, or maybe this is just what the sum of their parts is. I think that that is also a pretty fair way to say that. Weiwei is also getting dead of the game, or dead of the series, by the way, because the tempo was very much a problem. Even though he did get a pretty big objective steal, he really didn't actively keep up with Kanavi at any point, and he was a big reason why they lost. You could also give this to Scout, but Scout dominated game one on the Azir where he looked really good. I just wanted to get that out. That was kind of the time I wanted to take to talk about LNG, because I think that kind of mentality became very clear watching this series as opposed to, you know, watching them play against JDG last year. Is they're going to take a lot more risks. They're going to be a lot more quote-unquote proactive. It's just not all of the plays that they're going to take are going to be good ones, and last year a lot of the plays they took were good ones, and so certainly something to monitor, but I still think LNG is a good team. I don't know if they're top 4 right now. They feel like a team that's kind of a little bit on the outside. They're 500 in terms of game score. I think they will rebound to be a very competitive team, and top 4 is certainly not out of the realm of possibility for them, but I don't really know if I feel comfortable to put them in that slot right now, especially with NIP and Top Esports playing so well. And then for JD Gaming on the other side, this is a very good team. Again, top 2 in the region. Can they be 2023 JDG? Probably not, but not even in terms of like, can they be better than that? Yes, they can, but they're not going to be that team. I think there are expectations that they're going to play similarly. I do not think this team is similar to last year's version of JDG. They play very different. They capitalize on very different power spikes. I think they have the potential to overperform what happened last year, even with a more talented roster last year. But make a note, they are a very different team in terms of their play style, and I think that was exemplified here. And that brings us to our third and final series of Day 7 and our 17th and final series of the week. Long video. Again, I really do appreciate you guys sticking with me through it, but it was an interesting one between Royal Never Give Up and Weibo Gaming that Weibo takes relatively easily. This is not a huge upset. This is not a big surprise. I know they're next to each other in the power rankings, but truly there is a difference right now between the top 6. You know, I would say it's top 2 and then 3 through 6 and then everyone else. Like where it's so up for debate right now. RNG and WE feel like playoff teams, but everything else is still a major question mark, and Weibo coming out on top in this one is not particularly surprising for me, but let's talk about it. Player of the series, it's going to go to Crisp in the support position. He has been so integral to what Weibo has done across this split already. I know I hyped him up so much over the course of last year. I was a really big fan of how he played a lot of the series for Weibo when they were a much more aggressive team. They've continued to be very active, but I honestly think it's gotten more stable for this team, and I don't think it's just because the Shy is gone. I think Xiao Hao has really helped with that a bit as well. Xiao Hao's a very smart jungler, knows where he needs to be at any given time, is still very aggressive, and is definitely more carry-oriented in terms of how he plays, but it's not in the same way that Weiwei is, where Weibo, like I said, likes to take these 60-40. Xiao Hao is a lot more content playing in structure, and I think we're seeing Weibo go for that structure a bit more, and it's very much working out for them. Crisp is really the lone player that's taking a lot of these big feast or famine risks, as, you know, highlighted by the Zyra in game number 1, but for the most part, they're working out. Great Nami in game 2. The Zyra was very impactful in game number 1. Generally, he just looks really good, and honestly, in every series that they've played, he's either been the hero or the villain for basically every single game for them. He is going to be very integral to how they perform. Light, of course, the master of playing within structure, as I like to call it. If you give him an inch, he'll take a mile. You know, if you give him a mile, he'll probably still take a mile. Like, that's Light, right? He's not the kind to generate his own leads in the same way that maybe another, you know, superstar AD carry would, but capitalizing on leads that is really proactive and strong support or jungler are able to create for him, just about as good as anybody else in the world at doing that. Xiao Hu also easily had his best series of the year up until this point. That happens pretty often against Tong Yuan, who's just not very good in lane right now, but Xiao Hu looked amazing on the LeBlanc and was really able to move around the map and be very proactive. The Orianna was very good in that same way. ZDZ and Xiao Hao, the two anyone's legend players coming over here, looked good. I think generally this was just a nice series for Weibo. Nothing too extravagant, nothing too out there, nothing too crazy, but all of it kind of working for them in the long run. And then for RNG on the other side, this team is not very good. Like, I know they're good enough to probably be a playoff team. Like, they're 2-1, and they're going to beat up on teams that are worse than them. And, you know, that's a good, significant part of the league right now because there really aren't a lot of, you know, guaranteed good teams in the LPL. But this is not an upper echelon team. People were guaranteeing them in the top 5 at the start of this split. I was very hesitant to say that. I put them in my top 5, if only because the Demacia Cup results really scared me away from a team like Weibo and scared me away from teams like Ninjas and Pyjamas. But both of those teams have very much proven to absolutely be better than RNG at the start of this split. And a lot of it isn't just the young players. Done to this series is going to go to Wei in the jungle. I'm going to be honest, like, I know not everybody watches every single RNG game, but Wei has very quietly been like an elo bomber to RNG over the past couple of months. Like, the end of 2023 and the start of 2024, he has really not been a good League of Legends player. Hopefully that can turn around, but I don't really know what happened. His pathing has gotten worse. His early game impact is completely negligible, and he's super aggressive in teamfights, even when his team is playing at a major disadvantage, and it just puts him and his team in worse situations because of it. So I don't really know what to tell you. Wei has not been particularly good. Breathe has definitely been the stalwart on this team, but LWX and Ming probably had one of their more coherent series. Like I said, they were okay earlier this week, but Tong Yuan is just getting run over in the mid lane every single laning phase. It's just not working out for him. Breathe finally did not have a good series. This is the first one really in 2024 where he looked a bit outmatched, which is definitely something to monitor, but Weibo beating RNG isn't surprising. RNG is really just not that good of a team. I do not regret putting them a lot lower in my power rankings last week. They're the only team to lose a game to Edward Gaming right now, and they look very shaky. This is a team that is on thin ice when it comes to even being in the top 7. This is a team that's probably a lot closer to missing playoffs than they are to being an actual contender in the playoffs, and I don't think people were expecting that going into the split. I certainly was, and I certainly was lower on this team. Small pat on the back for those of you who made an hour and 40 minutes into this video, but, you know, I'm not really shocked by RNG struggling. It's going to be interesting to see if those struggles end up continuing, but at least for now, pretty anticipated. And then for Weibo, this is a good team, and honestly, they might even be better than they were last year in the grand scheme of things. They don't have the highs, I don't think, because the Shy, you know, gave you that, like, upside that you're just not going to have with ZDZ, but the Shy also gave you so much negative in the regular season. I could see this team finishing better in the regular season and having a better record and going to the playoffs feeling a lot more confident. confident with them. I don't know if that's definitely going to happen because there are still pieces on this team that need to show the growth, the top side of the map, but if Crisp is going to be the super big aggro player that, carries Light and Xiao Hao into these good situations that they can capitalize on, that's amazing. That's a strategy for Weibo to be able to win. I'm not going to say they are definitely better than a team that made World Finals, but, they're looking pretty good to start this year. All right, but that is going to do it for my LPL Week 2 overview and analysis video here in the Spring Split up on the screen. Now you can see the updated standings after 2 weeks of action. Of course, in the LPL, top 10 is all so important, so you can see the top 10 on the left side, the bottom 7 on the right side. Of course, there is a tie for 10th place. Don't worry about that. Any ties are just broken alphabetically, and these are ties including game score. And so, teams like AL and RNG, they have the same record and the same game score. Same for LGD and WE, etc., etc. Anybody who is tied in terms of these standings, it's just broken alphabetically. Of course, on the screen, you can see everybody from 1 to 17 in terms of their standings, but in the first column to the right of the team name, you can see power ranking. That is where I personally power rank these teams from number 1 to number 17 after week number 2. In the second column, you can see how that has changed from last week to this week. Let's go over the biggest risers and fallers. Let's just go over everything in general, and what you'll notice, top 8 right now, not changing. The top 8 is the exact same as it was. BLG, JDG, Top Esports, Ninjas in Pyjamas, LNG, Weibo Gaming, RNG, and WE, consisting of the top 8. They feel like the top 8, the teams that I feel pretty good about making the playoffs, even if they're not dominant teams at the current moment. Like I said, kind of a top 2, and then 3 to 6, and then 7 and 8. Those are kind of the 3 tiers, but all of them feel like they should be playoff teams, at least at the current moment, should everything continue to go according to plan. But everything else from there, moving around. Actually, number 9, OMG, is sticking there, but they are definitely the most contentious. They have not looked consistent at all, but they still probably look better than a lot of the other non-playoff teams in terms of consistency right now. But new at number 10, it's going to be Invictus Gaming, jumping up 4 spots from number 14. I did not believe in this team in the preseason. They didn't look great in week 1, but they looked very good here in week 2. Like I said, their floor just seems to be a bit higher than a lot of the other teams surrounding them right now, and that puts them at number 10 in my power rankings and in a playoff spot. Anyone's Legend jumping up to number 11, and that means Thunder Talk falling down to number 12. They were at 11 last week. They dropped a spot here. Still feel more comfortable in them than maybe some of the other very fluctuating teams around them in the power rankings, but they need to show me something else. They did not look good this week. FPX stays at 13. If they hadn't lost to Ultra Prime, they'd probably be at number 10 in these power rankings. That's genuinely how bad of a loss that ended up being for them. Coming in at 14, it is going to be LGD Gaming. This team is just better than I think I thought they were going to be. I thought bottom 2 was going to be pretty locked in, but LGD jumping up to 14 and Ultra Prime jumping up to 15 with their wins this week. They at least look competent, which is more than I can say for the bottom 2 teams. Edward Gaming falling all the way down from number 10 to number 16, dropping 6 spots in my power rankings. This team looks inept and incompetent at this point, only outdone by Rare Adam, who is a very clear number 17 in my power rankings. These are the bottom 2 teams in the league, not just because of standings, but because of the way that they've gotten there. These 2 teams feel like they can't win games at all. Even Ultra Prime has looked more consistent and more solid than these 2, and that is a very, very bad look. And so those are my updated power rankings. Let me know what you guys think of them down in the comment section below. What do you agree with? What do you disagree with? I know we're not going to agree on everything, so let me know what your thoughts are below, but it's time to move on to my player of the week and my dud of the week for week number 2 here in the LPL. Player of the week was actually so difficult, not because there were no good options, but because there were too many good options this week. I ended up narrowing it down to 3 people, but whoever you want to give it to out of these 3, please take it. Like, all 3 of them deserve it. I'm going to give it to Shun, the jungler for Bilibili. He was amazing in both of the series they played this week. Finally got a chance to shine on that Kindred game. Really excited for him. He played great, but honestly, if you wanted to give it to Shuo, the support for Ninjas in Pyjamas, he was also amazing. Him and Fodik had a great week as a duo, but it was really Shuo that impressed me and kind of soared into this like player of the week contention. And then Cryan, the mid laner for Invictus, they play through him so much and they give him so much responsibility in the mid to late game, and he really came through for them in a very important week for Invictus with 2 wins here. Really solid stuff from all 3. Again, whoever you want to give it to, I think it's just personal preference out of these 3 players in particular, but I'm going to give it to Jun. I think you could very realistically give it to Zhuo or Cryan, though. And then my dud of the week, unfortunately, it's going to go to a channel darling, Beishuan, the jungler for Thunder Talk Gaming, player that I've defended a lot on this channel over the years. It's just not been a good start. Basically, all the negatives that the naysayers were saying are true right now. The mechanics are just simply not good enough. He's making critical mistakes in the mid game. His team fighting has not been good enough, and his early game pressure has not been good enough. This team is struggling in most part because they're not able to generate any pressure out of the jungle position. Beishuan simply has to be better for Thunder Talk, or else this team is going to miss the playoffs once again. But That's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. Let me know what you think down in the comment section below. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like. It really does mean a lot. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you are new here, hit the subscribe button. We post about all 4 of the major regions, not just the LPL, every single week on this channel. The LCS, LEC, LCK, and LPL, and also the NACL, Tier 2 in North America. So if you're interested in a comprehensive overview of basically everything going on in LoL Esports, daily coverage, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day. And I will see you all later.